Tonight's journey is about borders, those invisible lines that people have drawn across our planet. Lines that can bring people together, split them apart, keep them safe, or confuse them. Some borders are older than anyone can remember, created by mountains and rivers. Others are so new that the ink on the treaties is still fresh. Wherever you are tonight, maybe tucked under your blankets or lying back after a long day, I invite you to let this story wash over you. Before we start our journey together, may I ask where you're listening from? One of the wonderful things about geography is that it connects us no matter where we are, and I'd love to know which corner of the world this video is reaching. And while you're here, if you'd be so kind, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. A heartfelt thank you as well to those who have already joined this little community. Your support keeps these journeys flowing like a steady river. Now, I do hope the video won't be so interesting that it keeps you wide awake. Though if it does, there's some comfort in knowing that at least your late-night wakefulness might be rewarded with a few curious facts about the world we live in. Geography, after all, is full of stories that are both soothing and quietly surprising. So, settle in and let your thoughts drift along with me as we begin. Borders are everywhere. But have you ever wondered why the world's map looks the way it does, and what secrets those lines might be hiding? Borders might seem like little more than markings on a globe or scratches of ink on an atlas, but they are among the most powerful inventions humanity has ever created. A border can determine who you are, what language you speak, and even how free you feel. They can start wars or bring peace, cut through mountains and rivers, and sometimes divide a single village into two different countries. In many ways, the shape of the world as we know it has been drawn not by nature, but by decisions about where one land ends and another begins. To understand borders is to understand how human beings have tried to tame the vast chaotic sprawl of the earth. They are stories of compromise and conflict, of ambition and fear. And though they are made by people, they often outlast the generations that first set them down. A line chosen in haste centuries ago may still decide the fate of millions today. In this journey, we'll drift across history and geography alike. We'll see how borders emerge from natural barriers like mountains and rivers before humans began carving lines of their own. We'll travel through time from ancient empires to modern nations and explore how borders have shifted, vanished, and reappeared again. We'll wander through the world's strangest dividing lines. Towns cut in half, countries that exist inside other countries, and pieces of land so disputed that no one quite claims them. But borders are not only about land. They exist in the seas and the skies, dividing invisible realms of ocean and air. And they exist within us, too, in the ways we think of us and them. By exploring them, we uncover more than just geography. We learn about humanity itself. So as you listen, allow yourself to drift between these lines. Just as rivers wander through valleys, what begins as ink on a map will become a story of how people shape the earth and how the earth, in turn, shapes us. And as the world grows ever more connected, one question rises above the rest. Are borders permanent, or are they simply moments in the long-flowing story of humanity? Long before maps were filled with neat grids of latitude and longitude, before kings and diplomats ever thought to ink treaties on parchment, the world already had its own boundaries. These were not written down, but they were felt. Mountains stood like immense stone walls. Rivers curled through valleys, carving paths that no human hand could match, and deserts spread like vast oceans of sand. To early people, These natural features were both guides and guardians. They told communities where their land ended and where the unknown began. Consider the towering Himalayas. Rising higher than the flight of most birds, they form a ridge so immense that it has acted as a barrier between the Indian subcontinent and the rest of Asia for thousands of years. Crossing such heights was not impossible, but it was perilous. And so these mountains became one of nature's clearest ways of saying here is one world and beyond is another. Mountains have long served this function, not just in Asia, but everywhere on Earth. The Pyrenees, for instance, separate Spain from France, while the Andes stretch like a spine down South America, shaping where people can live and how they move. Rivers, too, have always been powerful markers. Unlike mountains, which block the way, rivers often offer both division and connection. Take the Danube in Europe. For centuries, it has marked boundaries between empires, kingdoms, and nations. Yet it has also been a vital route for trade, carrying goods and ideas from the Black Forest in Germany to the Black Sea. The Nile in Egypt, though not thought of as a strict border, created a line between life and death itself. On one side of its banks stretched fertile fields and thriving settlements, while on the other lay barren desert. In this way, rivers often forced people to decide which side do we belong to. Deserts present a different kind of frontier. They're not physical walls like mountains, nor moving channels like rivers, but rather expanses so harsh that survival alone becomes the challenge. The Sahara, stretching wider than the continental United States, acted for millennia as a formidable divider between North Africa and the lands to the south. Crossing it required long caravans, specialized knowledge of oases, and tolerance for heat that could melt wax and sear flesh. For ancient societies, the desert was not just a boundary of sand, but a test of endurance and ingenuity. Even today, deserts like the Gobi or the Kalahari stand as reminders that sometimes nature itself dictates where human presence can and cannot extend. These natural walls were not only practical, they also inspired myths and stories. The Greeks imagined the river Oceanus as the outermost boundary of the known world and endless currents circling the earth. Many cultures viewed mountains as sacred, believing their peaks touched the heavens and separated mortals from gods. Deserts, meanwhile, were often thought of as places of trial, where heroes and prophets went to be tested, their emptiness acting as a crucible for transformation. In this sense, natural borders shaped not just geography, but also imagination. Yet it would be misleading to think of these natural divides as absolute. Humans are inventive, and even the highest cliffs or the driest sands eventually yielded to curiosity and determination. Ancient traders learned to navigate mountain passes, winding through narrow valleys that allowed them to move between regions. Desert dwellers like the Tuareg became experts at crossing landscapes others feared, turning inhospitable sand into a highway of camels and salt. In time, rivers that had once split communities became the arteries that joined them. The Rhine, for instance, was once a contested barrier between Roman lands and Germanic tribes, but centuries later it became a shared corridor of culture and commerce. Still, the pull of these features as dividers remained. Consider how often modern political borders follow natural lines. The Rio Grande separates the United States from Mexico. The Zambezi forms part of the boundary between Zambia and Zimbabwe. The rugged Carpathians curve across Eastern Europe, not only defining landscapes, but shaping languages and histories. Even with today's satellites and global positioning systems, the old instinct to treat natural features as convenient boundaries persists. After all, they are visible, tangible, and enduring in ways that human-made lines on a map are not. Nature's borders also influence the kind of societies that develop on either side. Communities separated by high mountains often evolve distinct languages and customs, their isolation acting as a shield for unique traditions. Deserts limit contact between regions, meaning that once they're crossed, the differences on the far side can be dramatic. Rivers, by contrast, encourage exchange, but still preserve separateness, much like a bridge that connects without erasing the gap it spans. Geography shapes culture just as much as it shapes terrain. It is remarkable to think that what we often take for granted, a mountain range drawn in gray on a map, a blue line marking a river, a pale sweep showing desert sands, once determined whether two peoples would meet or remain strangers. These features dictated where armies marched, where traders carried their wares, and where languages grew. They marked the difference between what was familiar and what was foreign. As human history unfolds, the role of natural boundaries continues to echo. They are reminders that long before rulers and cartographers invented borders with pen and ink, the earth itself provided them in stone, water, and sand. Mountains, rivers, and deserts were the first arbiters of territory, setting the stage upon which humanity's great story of movement, conflict, and connection would be written. They still stand today, silent but enduring, witnesses to the restless lines humans continue to draw upon their surfaces. The earliest human communities did not think in terms of states or nations. Their world was defined by where food could be found, where animals could be hunted, and where water flowed. Groups roamed and shifted as seasons demanded, boundaries flexible and temporary. But once humans discovered the power of farming, the story began to change. Settled agriculture meant fixed land, and fixed land demanded rules. Out of the fertile fields of Mesopotamia, the floodplains of the Nile and the rolling hills of early Rome, emerged some of the first true borders. They were not just lines in the dirt, but markers of power, ownership, and identity. In Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers created a fertile crescent that sustained some of humanity's earliest city-states. Cities like Ur, Lagash, and Uruk sprouted like seeds in this rich land. Each city controlled surrounding fields and villages, and with that control came disputes. Farmers argued over irrigation channels, over who had rights to water during dry seasons, or where one field ended and another began. To manage this, rulers and scribes began marking boundaries with clay tablets and even carved stones. One surviving example, known as a kuduru, was essentially a boundary marker that recorded land grants complete with curses to ward off anyone foolish enough to move it. These early efforts show how borders first grew from the soil itself, a way of deciding who could reap and who could not. Further west along the Nile, ancient Egypt developed a different but equally fascinating relationship with borders. Egypt's geography made it both simple and complex to define. The fertile strip of land hugging the Nile was a ribbon of green through an otherwise inhospitable desert. Everyone knew where Egypt began and ended. You could see it in the line where lush fields gave way to sand. Yet Egyptian rulers were never content with that natural edge. Pharaohs sent armies south into Nubia, east into the Sinai, and west into the desert, carving out shifting frontiers that marked Egypt as both river kingdom and empire. Border fortresses such as those in Nubia served as checkpoints, monitoring trade, guarding against invasion, and declaring this far and no further. The Nile itself also provided a kind of living border inside Egypt. It was the great unifier, a north-south highway linking cities and temples But it also acted as a divider of sorts. Villages on the east bank were linked with sunrise and life, while the west bank was associated with sunset and the land of the dead. In this symbolic sense, even a single river could carry multiple meanings as a border, physical, political, and spiritual, all at once. Meanwhile, in the lands around the Mediterranean, another border story was being written. Early Rome began as a small settlement along the Tiber River. Its first boundaries were humble walls of earth and stone built to protect against raiders and rival tribes. Yet from those simple beginnings grew one of the most formidable systems of borders the world has ever seen. As Rome expanded from city to republic to empire, its borders stretched outward in every direction. To manage such vast territory, Romans built not just roads but also frontier fortifications. Hadrian's Wall in Britain, for example, marked the northern limit of Roman authority in the island. Stretching for over 70 miles, it was both a military defense and a statement of Roman power. On the other side lay the untamed lands of the Picts, a reminder that every border was as much about what was outside as what was inside. Roman borders were also administrative. The empire was divided into provinces, each with governors, tax collectors, and soldiers to enforce control. These lines were not drawn casually. They reflected careful consideration of geography, resources, and existing communities. In some places, like along the Danube or Rhine, rivers naturally defined frontiers. In others, lines cut across landscapes arbitrarily, imposed by Rome's will rather than nature's hand. The empire's borders constantly shifted with wars, treaties, and rebellions. But the very idea that territory could be so clearly managed and divided was one of Rome's enduring legacies. What unites these early examples, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Rome, is the recognition that borders are not just about land. They are about people, power, and control. A border might mark where a crop can be grown or where a tax must be paid. It might separate one god's temple from another's, or declare who must obey a king and who does not. Borders emerged because human societies grew complex enough to need them. Once trade networks stretched further, once armies marched farther, once wealth and resources had to be protected, borders became essential tools of order. Yet, it is striking how fragile these early boundaries could be. A season of flooding might shift the channel of a river, erasing carefully marked lines. A successful invasion could redraw the edge of a kingdom overnight. Even within a single generation, the meaning of a border could change completely. What mattered was not the permanence of the line, but the authority behind it. Borders, in this sense, were as much about belief as they were about geography. People had to agree or be forced to agree that the line mattered. There's also a thread of creativity running through these first borders. They were expressed in stone stelae, clay tablets, walled fortresses, and monumental architecture. They were justified with myths and rituals blessed by priests and kings. In Mesopotamia, curses inscribed on boundary markers called upon gods to punish anyone who tampered with them. In Egypt, the very deserts were seen as realms of chaos, reinforcing the ordered heartland of the Nile Valley as a chosen domain. In Rome, borders were sanctified by ceremonies in which oxen plowed furrows to mark sacred boundaries. Each culture blended the practical need for limits with a symbolic language that made those limits meaningful. By the time these early states had fully matured, borders were more than lines. They were expressions of identity. To say you were Egyptian was to live within the life-giving reach of the Nile. To be Roman was to exist under the empire's protective shadow, bound by its laws and roads. To belong to a Mesopotamian city-state was to share in its gods, its harvest, and its defense. Borders told people who they were as much as where they were. From these beginnings, the concept of the border grew into something that could expand with empires and contract with their fall. The seeds planted in Mesopotamian clay, nourished along the Nile and built in Roman stone, created the foundation for all that followed. They remind us that as soon as humans settled in one place, they felt the urge to define it, to say, "This is ours and beyond lies something else." That simple act of definition has shaped the destiny of civilizations ever since. For much of human history, the ground beneath our feet was not something to be fenced or claimed, but a vast stage across which people moved. Nomadic groups drifted with the seasons, following herds of animals, chasing the green flush of new pastures, or seeking water wherever it could be found. To them, land was not a possession, but a pathway. Then came the farmers, the builders of villages and granaries, who saw the same earth not as a road but as a foundation. They dug ditches, planted seeds, built walls, and said, "Here we stay." This meeting of fluid and fixed ways of life has shaped borders and conflicts ever since. Nomadic life is as old as humanity itself. Our ancestors wandered long before they ever settled, carrying what they needed, adapting to landscapes from the Siberian tundra to the African savanna. Pastoral nomads in particular thrived by herding animals across wide distances. The Bedouin of Arabia, the Mongols of Central Asia, and the Tuareg of the Sahara each developed astonishing skills for surviving in places most people would struggle to endure. For them, mobility was freedom. Borders, when they appeared, were puzzling and often meaningless. What did it matter if some ruler 100 miles away declared a river or a mountain as a dividing line? A nomad's horizon was not measured in ownership, but in opportunity. Settlers, however, saw the world differently. Agriculture required stability. Fields of wheat or rice demanded constant attention. Irrigation systems needed upkeep, and harvest had to be protected from both animals and raiders. The rise of farming meant the rise of fixed communities, and with them the first serious attempts to draw boundaries. For a farmer, knowing exactly where the field ended was vital. For a herder, wandering into that field could be the spark for conflict. Thus tension grew wherever these two ways of life overlapped. This tension is visible in countless stories from history. In the Middle East, settled farmers along river valleys often clashed with desert tribes who raided their lands or demanded access to water. In North Africa, the nomadic Berbers navigated between trade and conflict with agricultural societies along the Mediterranean coast. Perhaps the most famous example comes from the steppes of Eurasia, where nomadic horsemen like the Scythians, the Huns, and later the Mongols confronted the settled empires of China, Persia, and Europe. To the Chinese, the nomads were troublesome barbarians who ignored the neat logic of walls and frontiers. To the nomads, the empires were static targets, brimming with wealth. The Great Wall of China was not just a monument of stone, but a desperate attempt to keep one world view from colliding with another. Yet it would be wrong to imagine nomads and settlers as locked in endless opposition. In truth, their lives were intertwined. Nomads supplied settlers with goods they could not easily produce themselves: horses, wool, hides, and often the transport of trade along far-reaching routes. Settlers in turn provided grain, tools, and manufactured goods. Caravans crossing deserts, steppe riders carrying silk and spices, and Bedouin traders guiding merchants across the Arabian Peninsula all show how fluid and fixed societies could depend on one another. The border between them was not a sharp line, but a shifting zone of exchange, negotiation, and sometimes uneasy coexistence. The friction lay in their fundamentally different understandings of space. For a nomad, territory was shared. Grass was for grazing, water for drinking, and the world was large enough to keep moving. For a settler, land was private, owned by a family, guarded by fences or ditches, and taxed by rulers. When these perspectives collided, each side found the other bewildering. Farmers saw nomads as intruders who respected no limits. Nomads saw farmers as greedy hoarders who locked away what should have been open to all. This contrast also shaped politics. Rulers of settled states often tried to control nomads by offering tribute, demanding loyalty, or forcibly settling them. Empires from Rome to China experimented with granting land to nomadic groups in exchange for military service, effectively turning wandering warriors into frontier guards. Sometimes it worked, creating hybrid communities that blended both lifestyles. Other times it failed, spectacularly, when newly settled groups rose in rebellion or abandoned the plow to take up raiding once more. Religion and culture added more layers to this divide. In many traditions, this nomadic way of life was romanticized as free, pure, and uncorrupted, while farmers were seen as tied down, burdened by toil. In other accounts, the opposite was true. Nomads were portrayed as lawless marauders, while settlers represented order and civilization. The truth, of course, was far more complicated, with both sides borrowing from each other constantly. The Mongols, once they established their empire, quickly adapted to many aspects of settled life, ruling cities, and even supporting trade and scholarship. Meanwhile, frontier farmers often picked up skills from nomads, learning how to ride, herd, and survive in harsh landscapes. Even in modern times, echoes of this ancient dynamic remain. Nomadic groups still exist, from reindeer herders in Siberia to pastoralists in East Africa. They often find themselves squeezed by the fixed borders of modern nation-states. Their traditional migrations crossing lines that governments insist must not be crossed. Settlers may have won the long struggle by sheer numbers, but the nomadic spirit persists, reminding us that mobility has always been part of human identity. The meeting of nomads and settlers teaches an important lesson. Borders are not just physical features or political agreements, but reflections of how people imagine space itself. For some, land is a home to be defended. For others, it is a pathway to be traveled. When those visions overlap, the result is not just conflict, but creativity, trade, and cultural exchange. The story of borders cannot be told without acknowledging this dance between the moving and the still. From the deserts of Arabia to the grasslands of Mongolia, from the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the farthest frontiers of Rome, this meeting has shaped civilizations again and again. Fixed lines and fluid lives have always pressed against each other, reshaping the map in ways both subtle and dramatic. It is a reminder that the way humans draw lines across the earth has never been inevitable. It has always been a choice, and sometimes a compromise between those who stay and those who keep moving. When most people think of borders, they imagine lines on a map, invisible and abstract. But sometimes those lines were made into something far more solid. Great walls of stone, earth, and brick stretching for miles across the land. These were borders you could actually touch. Borders that cast shadows and forced weary travelers to go around or seek permission to pass through. They were feats of engineering as much as they were statements of fear and power. Among them, two of the most famous stand out: the Great Wall of China and Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Both tell us a great deal about how rulers tried to manage the world outside their control. The Great Wall of China is not a single wall, but rather a series of fortifications built, rebuilt, and connected over centuries. Its earliest sections date back more than 2,000 years to the time of the warring states when rival kingdoms sought to defend themselves from steppe nomads and one another. When the first emperor of a unified China, Qin Shi Huang, rose to power in the 3rd century, before the Common Era, he ordered these scattered barriers linked together, creating a monumental line meant to hold back the Xiongnu horsemen from the north. Later dynasties expanded and reinforced it, turning it into the massive structure that winds across northern China today. At its height, the Great Wall stretched over 13,000 miles, crossing deserts, mountains, and plains. Watchtowers punctuated the length of the wall, and soldiers stationed within them lit beacon fires to warn of approaching raids. From a distance, it looked like a stone dragon snaking across the earth, a visible sign that here ended the realm of the emperor, and beyond lay danger. But the wall was never truly impenetrable. Nomadic horsemen could always find ways around through gaps, or even over bribes offered at the gates. The Mongols, led by Genghis Khan, famously swept past it in the 13th century, proving that even the mightiest barrier could not guarantee safety. Yet the wall was never just about stopping invaders. It was also about projecting strength. For farmers and merchants within China's borders, it was a reassurance that the state cared for their security. For outsiders, it was a message in stone that said, "This land is guarded. This empire is vast, and its rulers command the resources to build such a thing." Far away on the misty frontiers of Roman Britain, another wall was being raised, one that served a similar purpose on a smaller scale. Around the year 122 of the Common Era, Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of a barrier stretching across the narrowest part of northern England. The wall ran for nearly 80 miles from coast to coast, cutting across hills and valleys with a mixture of stone and turf. Its purpose was not only to keep out the tribes to the north, often called the Picts, but also to control trade and movement. Hadrian's wall bristled with mile castles, small fortlets placed roughly every Roman mile, and larger forts garrisoned with soldiers from across the empire. Imagine men from Syria, Spain, or North Africa standing watch in the chilly rain of Britain, peering northward across the rolling hills. The wall was not especially tall by modern standards, but it was formidable enough, especially when combined with ditches and palisades. Like the Great Wall, it was as much psychological as practical, a demonstration of Roman order at the edge of chaos. Life along the wall was not one of endless battle, but of routine and interaction. Archaeological evidence suggests that local Britons traded with Roman soldiers, supplying them with goods and perhaps even mingling socially. The wall in this sense was not just a barrier, but a contact zone, a place where cultures brushed against one another under the watchful eye of Rome. It reminds us that borders, even when made of stone, are rarely absolute. Great walls elsewhere tell similar stories. The Persians built long defensive lines like the Gorgan Wall in modern Iran, a red brick fortification stretching for nearly 200 miles to shield their empire's vulnerable northern frontier. In Korea, remnants of walls built during the Three Kingdoms period show the same logic. Guard against nomads, defend against rivals, and make a visible claim to territory. Even in Central America, the Maya constructed walled cities not as endless barriers across the land, but as localized defenses, asserting authority and keeping rivals at bay. What unites these walls is not perfection in keeping outsiders out, for history shows they often failed, but the statement they made. Walls declared identity. They marked a separation between us and them, civilization and wilderness, order and chaos. They turned invisible concepts of territory into tangible structures of earth and stone. To walk alongside them, even today, is to feel the weight of that statement. The human urge to draw lines that can be seen, touched, and defended. It is tempting to think of these walls as symbols of fear, and indeed they were often built in response to raids and invasions. But they were also symbols of ambition. They showed that a ruler had the power to marshal armies of laborers, quarry stone, transport materials across long distances, and maintain fortifications for decades or centuries. To construct a wall on such a scale was to declare mastery over both people and landscape. Of course, there is also an irony in these monuments. For all their grandeur, they rarely achieved their intended purpose completely. The Great Wall could not prevent invasions. Hadrian's Wall did not stop all northern tribes, and countless other barriers were breached time and again. Yet in their failure, they remind us of something deeply human, the desire for certainty in an uncertain world. Building a wall gave the illusion of control, even if the reality was messier. Today, many of these ancient walls still stand, their stones weathered, but enduring silent witnesses to centuries of change. Tourists walk along Hadrian's Wall, gazing at sheep-dotted hills instead of hostile tribes. Sections of the Great Wall climb steep ridges carrying not soldiers but hikers and school groups. These relics have outlasted the very empires that built them, turning from defenses into symbols of cultural pride. When we look at them now, it is easy to see only the ruins, but behind each stone lies a story of fear, ambition, and identity. The great walls of history were never perfect borders, but they were powerful ones. They taught the world that sometimes to mark a boundary, humans will build not just a line, but a monument stretching as far as the eye can see. If you were to unfold a map of Europe during the Middle Ages, you would not find the neat national boundaries we know today. Instead, you would see a patchwork quilt of lordships, duchies, bishoprics, kingdoms, and tiny territories stitched together in a dazzlingly complex mosaic. Borders in the medieval world were rarely clear-cut lines. More often, they were vague zones of influence, subject to dispute, renegotiation, and outright conquest. To live in medieval Europe was to live in a shifting landscape, where your allegiance could change, not just in your lifetime, but even in the course of a single season. At the heart of this patchwork was the feudal system. Land was divided among lords who owed loyalty to more powerful lords who in turn swore allegiance to kings. Each layer of this pyramid rested upon the promise of protection and service. A border then might not be marked by a stone wall or riverbank, but by the reach of a particular lord's authority. Imagine riding through the countryside. One day you paid taxes to the Duke of Normandy. The next day you crossed into land governed by an abbey, and further along you entered territory claimed by the king himself. The land looked much the same, but the rules, obligations, and rights might change completely. In this environment, castles became vital symbols of control. A fortress on a hill was not just a defensive stronghold, but also a visible reminder of whose power extended across the surrounding fields. Borderlands were often studded with castles, each one acting as a beacon of authority. The frontier between England and Wales, for example, bristled with Norman castles in the 12th and 13th centuries, as marcher lords sought to tame and hold the rugged Welsh landscape. To pass from one side to the other was to cross not only into different terrain, but also into a different political reality. Borders were especially fluid in regions where powerful neighbors pressed against each other. The Holy Roman Empire, sprawling across Central Europe, was famously fragmented. It was less a single state than a confederation of hundreds of principalities, counties, and free cities. Boundaries shifted constantly as emperors, dukes, and bishops negotiated, fought, and inherited lands. A peasant farmer might live his entire life within a few miles of his village, yet the question of whose lord he served could be rewritten several times during his lifetime. Religion added yet another layer to this medieval geography. The papal states in Italy were governed directly by the Pope blend in spiritual and temporal authority in a way that blurred conventional borders. Pilgrimage routes, such as the Camino de Santiago, crossed numerous territories, forcing travelers to pass through a patchwork of tolls, taxes, and protections offered by different lords. The Crusader states in the Levant were themselves products of shifting frontiers carved from conquest and constantly threatened by surrounding powers. These territories were fragile, defined less by stable borders and more by the ebb and flow of war. One of the best examples of this constant flux was the border between England and Scotland. Far from being fixed, it was a zone of raiding, feuding, and occasional treaties. Families known as border reivers developed reputations as cattle thieves and opportunistic warriors, switching loyalties as circumstances required. For them, the frontier was not a line, but a way of life. Stability was rare, and identity could be as changeable as the weather. In Eastern Europe, borders were even less fixed. The Polish-Lithuanian frontier, for instance, was constantly in motion, with noble families expanding or losing influence depending on their fortunes. The Hungarian kingdom pressed into the Carpathians and across the plains, its edges constantly tested by nomadic incursions from the steppe. In such regions, the frontier was not a wall, but a zone of contact where cultures blended and clashed. Villages might speak one language in the marketplace and another at home, reflecting the fluid nature of belonging. The medieval world was also filled with enclaves and exclaves that would baffle any modern geographer. One town might owe allegiance to a bishop, while the fields surrounding it were claimed by a duke. Islands of territory were scattered like chess pieces across the map. Some cities, such as Lubeck or Venice, carved out commercial empires whose influence stretched far beyond their immediate surroundings, creating pockets of power and wealth embedded in larger political entities. In these cases, the notion of a tidy border simply did not exist. Warfare naturally redrew many of these boundaries. The 100 Years' War between England and France saw vast swaths of land shift hands multiple times. Treaties were signed and broken, castles besieged and retaken. Villages pledged loyalty to whichever side seemed stronger that month. For the people who lived through it, stability was a rare luxury. Borders were not eternal, but temporary arrangements, always subject to the fortunes of battle and marriage alliances. Yet despite all this instability, medieval borders mattered. They determined who had the right to collect taxes, who provided protection, and who dispensed justice. They might not have been marked by precise survey lines, but they were deeply felt by those who lived within them. To be inside a lord's domain was to be under his law. To cross into another's territory might mean paying new tolls, swearing new oaths, or even facing hostile patrols. The patchwork appearance of medieval maps was not a mistake or an oversight, but a true reflection of how power and land were organized. It is important to remember that medieval people did not see this as chaotic. To them, the system made sense. Borders were defined by relationships and obligations rather than exact geography. What mattered was not a line on a map, but who could enforce authority in a given place. A forest could belong to the crown, a monastery, and a local noble all at once, depending on the type of rights being discussed. In a way, medieval borders were layered, reflecting the multiple claims of kings, nobles, and clergy. The legacy of this patchwork world can still be seen today. Many European regions preserve the outlines of medieval lordships in their modern boundaries. The independence of small countries like Liechtenstein, San Marino, and Andorra has roots in medieval divisions. Even the notion of an autonomous cities with rights separate from surrounding territories grew from this period. Though modern maps look cleaner, the echoes of the Middle Ages remain in the odd shapes and tiny survivals that resist absorption. Medieval borders remind us that geography is not always about straight lines and precision. It can be messy, overlapping, and negotiated. It can shift with wars, marriages, and papal decrees. To trace the borders of the Middle Ages is to wander through a world of castles, cloisters, treaties, and feuds. A world where power was fragmented and where the map looked like a kaleidoscope in constant motion. Far from being a flaw, that complexity was the essence of medieval political life, a vivid reminder that borders are human creations, always subject to change. When European empires expanded across the globe in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, they did not just conquer lands and peoples, they also remade maps. The colonial era was an age of cartography as much as it was of conquest, with explorers, surveyors, and administrators drawing lines on parchment that often ignored the realities of the ground beneath their feet. The act of mapping was not neutral. It was a declaration of ownership and intent. A ruler in London, Paris, or Lisbon could point to a colored shape on a globe and say, "This is ours," even if the people living there had never heard of that ruler nor agreed to such a claim. Nowhere was this more striking than in Africa. In the late 19th century, European powers rushed to stake claims in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, diplomats gathered not in the deserts or forests of Africa itself, but in far-off Germany, to carve the continent into zones of influence. With maps spread before them, they drew borders with rulers and pens, slicing through communities, kingdoms, and landscapes, with little regard for existing realities. One straight line might cut through a desert where nomads roamed freely. Another might bisect a river valley where villages had traded for centuries. The results can still be seen today in borders that stretch unnaturally straight for hundreds of miles, reflecting the geometry of Europe conference rooms more than the geography of Africa itself. This carving of the map was not just careless. It was deliberate. Simpler, straighter lines made for easier administration, at least from the perspective of colonial governments. But they created long-term consequences. Groups with historic rivalries were suddenly forced within the same state, while families and cultures were split apart. The effects of these colonial borders echo into the present, contributing to conflicts and political challenges long after the empires themselves dissolved. Asia, too, felt the weight of colonial cartography. In India, the British undertook massive surveys, most famously the Great Trigonometrical Survey, begun in the early 19th century. With painstaking measurements and endless manpower, surveyors mapped the subcontinent in extraordinary detail. Their work was a marvel of science and mathematics, but it was also a tool of control. Precise maps allowed the British to collect taxes, exploit resources, and move troops efficiently. For Indian peasants, those carefully drawn boundary lines might mean new demands for revenue or restrictions on traditional rights to forests and rivers. In Southeast Asia, colonial borders were equally transformative. The French in Indochina, the Dutch in Indonesia, and the British in Malaya all imposed new territorial divisions. The borders between modern Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, for example, were products of French colonial administration rather than ancient history. Similarly, the outlines of Malaysia and Indonesia grew out of agreements between European powers about spheres of influence. Once again, maps in European capitals determined realities thousands of miles away. Cartography during the colonial era was also deeply symbolic. A map was a statement of possession, a way to make distant lands visible and claimable. Colonial powers often filled in maps with bold colors, shading Africa in red for Britain, blue for France, green for Portugal, and so on. The brighter the color, the stronger the illusion of control, even if, in practice, European influence might be limited to coastal forts or a few rivers. For people back home in Europe, these maps suggested that vast swaths of the globe had been neatly claimed and secured, though the reality on the ground was often far more complex and contested. Yet for all its arrogance, colonial mapping also produced valuable geographic knowledge. Surveyors recorded mountains, rivers, and coastlines with a precision that earlier generations could not achieve. Maps from this era helped expand scientific understanding of the world's physical features. The problem was that the purposes behind this knowledge were rarely neutral. The primary goal was extraction and governance, not curiosity for its own sake. A river on a colonial map was not just a geographic feature. It was a potential trade route for goods or a natural boundary for taxation. Some of the strangest consequences of colonial cartography were the creation of enclaves and oddly shaped borders. In Africa, the border between Gambia and Senegal follows the course of the Gambia River, producing a narrow, elongated country that looks as if it has been squeezed between its neighbors. In South Asia, the border between India and Bangladesh once contained hundreds of tiny enclaves and counter-enclaves, small patches of land belonging to one country entirely surrounded by the other. These bizarre features, products of both colonial deals and older feudal arrangements, show how borders can become absurdly complex once humans start slicing up space. Colonial powers often defended their actions by arguing that they were bringing order and civilization. Maps with their grids and labels were part of this rhetoric. To draw a map was to suggest that the land was now known, measured, and controlled. But for those who lived under colonial rule, the new borders often felt like cages rather than protections. They restricted traditional patterns of movement, divided families and cultures, and imposed unfamiliar authorities. The contrast between the clean lines of a colonial map and the messy realities of human life was stark. Even after the colonial empires fell in the 20th century, the maps they left behind continued to shape the world. Many newly independent nations adopted the colonial borders as their own, partly because redrawing them would have been even more destabilizing. This principle, sometimes called utii possidetis, meant that the arbitrary lines drawn in European conference rooms became the foundations of modern states. In Africa and Asia alike, people were left to build national identities within boundaries that had little to do with their past. Looking back, the story of colonial cartography is both fascinating and troubling. On one hand, it represents an extraordinary effort to measure and record the world using mathematics, instruments, and sheer determination. On the other, it demonstrates how power can be projected through something as simple as a line on paper. Borders created in this way remind us that maps are never just scientific documents. They're political acts. They can illuminate, but they can also erase. The colonial carving of Africa and Asia stands as a powerful reminder that borders are not only about geography. They're also about authority, imagination, and ambition. A ruler's penstroke in Berlin or London could alter lives thousands of miles away, reshaping communities that had endured for centuries. Today, when we look at the straight borders of Africa or the intricate frontiers of South Asia, we are seeing the legacy of those cartographic decisions. Their lines drawn in ink, but they continue to influence the world in ways far more lasting than their makers ever imagined. Empires are among the most dramatic painters of borders the world has ever seen. They expand like tidal waves, sweep across territories, redraw maps with swift strokes, and then often, just as suddenly, they recede, leaving behind altered landscapes and fractured legacies. To follow the age of empires is to watch the earth itself being constantly reorganized, boundaries shifting like lines drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. Expansion, collapse, and reconfiguration were the rhythm of human history for centuries. Consider the Roman Empire. At its height in the 2nd century of the Common Era, Rome controlled vast swaths of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Its borders stretched from the windswept highlands of Scotland to the sands of the Sahara, from the Atlantic coasts of Iberia to the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia. The Romans created an astonishing infrastructure to manage this enormous realm, building roads, fortresses, and provincial boundaries that carved the empire into manageable units. Yet even Rome, with all its might, could not hold forever. By the 5th century, external pressures from migrating tribes, internal strife, and economic troubles fractured the empire. The western half collapsed into a mosaic of kingdoms, while the eastern half endured as Byzantium, shifting its focus to new centers of power. The borders that had once been held in place by legions dissolved, replaced by smaller, less stable entities. The ebb and flow of empire is not unique to Rome. The Mongols created the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from the Pacific shores of China to the plains of Hungary in little more than a generation. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols redrew maps on an almost unimaginable scale, absorbing entire cultures and states into their realm. But such rapid expansion was difficult to sustain. Within a century, the empire fractured into separate khanates, each with its own ambitions and vulnerabilities. The grand sweep of Mongol power left behind a legacy of altered borders, trade routes, and cultural exchange. But the empire itself was fleeting compared to the civilizations it conquered. The Ottoman Empire offers another perspective. Rising in the late 13th century, it expanded steadily, swallowing Byzantine lands, seizing Constantinople in 1453, and eventually reaching deep into Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The Ottomans were masters at managing frontiers, creating flexible borders that allowed them to expand and contract without collapsing entirely. Their boundaries were not rigid walls, but zones of influence, often negotiated with local rulers and shifting according to military success. For centuries, the Ottoman frontiers pressed against those of Habsburg, Austria, and the Russian Empire, creating one of the great border rivalries of early modern history. Yet even the Ottomans could not resist the tide of decline. By the 19th century, nationalist movements and European encroachment steadily eroded their territory, culminating in the empire's collapse after the First World War. The British Empire, meanwhile, expanded not by contiguous conquest, but by maritime reach. With ships crossing oceans, Britain established colonies and protectorates in every hemisphere. At its height in the 19th century, the British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land surface. Its borders were not continuous frontiers, but scattered enclaves, islands and dominions connected by sea routes and held together by naval supremacy. This type of empire created a different cartographic legacy, filling maps with patches of red scattered across the globe rather than one solid mass. When the empire receded after the Second World War, the borders it left behind in India and Pakistan, in Africa and the Caribbean, often became the foundations of modern nation-states. The collapse was as transformative as the expansion had been, producing entirely new patterns of sovereignty. Borders under empires were often fluid in practice, even if they looked firm on a map. In many cases, the outer edges of empire were less lines than gradients, fading zones where influence and culture blended. On the fringes of the Chinese Empire, for instance, the frontier was managed through tributary systems rather than rigid control, with neighboring states paying homage in exchange for autonomy. In West Africa, empires like Mali and Songhai expanded along trade routes, their borders defined more by the flow of goods and tribute than by fixed geography. These arrangements meant that imperial maps were dynamic, constantly redrawn to reflect the changing balance of power. The collapse of empires often left behind jagged scars in the form of contested borders. When the Spanish Empire unraveled in the Americas during the 19th century, newly independent states inherited colonial boundaries that were sometimes illogical or poorly defined. Disputes erupted, leading to conflicts such as the War of the Pacific between Chile, Peru, and Bolivia. Similarly, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved at the end of the First World War, its patchwork of nationalities was reshuffled into new states with borders drawn hastily at peace conferences. The legacy of empire was instability as much as it was unity. Yet empires were not only about war and collapse. They also created vast cultural crossroads, places where ideas, languages, and religions mingled. The Roman limes, or frontier zones, were bustling with trade and exchange as much as they were with soldiers. The Mongol Empire's Pax Mongolica allowed merchants to travel from Europe to China along the Silk Road with relative safety, knitting distant parts of the world together. The Ottoman borderlands were melting pots of Turks, Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, and Slavs. Borders may have been drawn and redrawn, but they were never absolute walls. They were porous, and through them flowed the lifeblood of cultural interaction. It is striking how similar the stories of expansion and collapse can seem across different empires. Each one rises with ambition, stretches itself across diverse peoples and geographies, struggles to maintain cohesion, and eventually falls victim to pressures both internal and external. Yet the traces they leave behind, the languages spoken, the religions practiced, the borders inherited, are lasting. Look at the linguistic map of South America, the patchwork of Slavic states in Eastern Europe, or the mosaic of nations that emerged from colonial Asia, and you can still see the ghostly outlines of past empires. The age of empires teaches us that borders are not eternal. They are drawn by the powerful, erased by rivals, and reshaped by circumstance. They may stand for centuries like the frontiers of Rome or the walls of Constantinople, but eventually they shift. Expansion and collapse are as much a part of the human story as the rise and fall of the tides. To study empires is to see borders in motion, never fixed, always subject to the ambitions and frailties of those who rule. In the end, the maps of the age of empires are reminders of both grandeur and impermanence. They show us how far human ambition can stretch and how quickly it can unravel. They reveal the sheer creativity of rulers who imagine their dominion spanning mountains, deserts, and seas, and the limits of that imagination when faced with the stubborn realities of geography, economy, and human will. Borders drawn by empires may vanish, but their echoes linger, shaping the world we live in today. Some borders look as though they were drawn by a surveyor with a ruler, stretching in straight lines across deserts or cutting neatly through forests. Others look like they were scribbled by a child with a crayon, twisting and curling with no apparent logic. But then there are borders so odd, so eccentric, that they almost feel like accidents of geography and history conspiring together. Among the strangest of these are the patchwork town of Baarle, the unclaimed desert triangle of Bir Tawil, and the misplaced slice of America known as Point Roberts. Each tells a story of how messy and sometimes amusing the business of dividing the world can be. Baarle is perhaps the most famous example of border absurdity. Straddling Belgium and the Netherlands, this small town is a jumble of enclaves and counter-enclaves that defies any attempt at simplicity. To put it plainly, Baarle is divided into dozens of pieces where tiny patches of Belgium sit inside Dutch territory, and in some cases Dutch territory is nestled within Belgian territory that is itself inside the Netherlands. It is Geography by Russian Dahl. Walk down a street in Baarle, and you may cross the international border multiple times without even noticing until you see a change in house numbering, a different flag fluttering, or a line of white crosses embedded in the pavement to remind you that you have just stepped into another country. The roots of this peculiarity go back to medieval land deals when dukes and local lords carved up land according to feudal bargains rather than coherent national boundaries. By the time Belgium became independent in the 19th century, those complicated arrangements had hardened into official borders. Today, the town embraces its bizarre geography. Shops exploit their location, placing front doors strategically in one country or another to take advantage of tax differences. During the pandemic, when each country imposed slightly different lockdown rules, a store in Baarle could legally close one entrance while leaving another open simply by virtue of which side of the border it happened to face. For the residents, the strange frontier is just part of daily life. But for visitors, it is like stepping into a cartographic puzzle brought to life. From the confusing to the strangely empty, the story of Bir Tawil takes us deep into the desert between Egypt and Sudan. This small, barren triangle of land has the unusual distinction of being claimed by no one at all. At roughly 800 square miles, Bir Tawil is not large, but in the context of the modern world, where every scrap of territory is usually spoken for, it is astonishing to find a piece of land unclaimed. The reason lies in a quirk of colonial cartography. In 1899, Britain, then overseeing Egypt, declared that the political border between Egypt and Sudan would follow the 22nd parallel. But a few years later, in 1902, British administrators created a different boundary to better reflect how local people used the land, giving Sudan control over the Halaib Triangle and Egypt control of Bir Tawil. The problem is that both modern Egypt and Sudan want the fertile and resource-rich Halaib Triangle, not the arid and useless Bir Tawil. To claim one would mean giving up the other. So both countries simply insist the land belongs to the other side. The result is that Bir Tawil has become a kind of no man's land, a territory without a state. Over the years, adventurous individuals have planted flags there, declaring micronations with fanciful names. One American even traveled there in 2014, raised a flag and declared it the Kingdom of North Sudan so that his daughter could officially be a princess. Needless to say, no one recognized his sovereignty, but the story shows how unusual Bir Tawil is. One of the very few places on Earth where, at least technically, land remains unclaimed. Then there is Point Roberts, a tiny peninsula dangling from Canada that somehow belongs to the United States. To understand how this geographical oddity came to be, We need to go back to the mid-19th century, when Britain and the United States agreed to fix their border along the 49th parallel. Sounded straightforward, a neat straight line stretching from the Rockies to the Pacific. But there was a catch. The 49th parallel slices through the Sawasan Peninsula just south of Vancouver. The tip of the peninsula therefore ended up on the American side of the line, even though it is physically attached to Canada. The result is Point Roberts, a small American exclave that can only be reached by land through Canada. Life in Point Roberts has its peculiarities. Residents must cross an international border whenever they drive to the nearest American town. School children, for example, ride a bus that takes them across the Canadian border twice each day as they head to and from their schools in Washington state. Everyday tasks that would be simple elsewhere, shopping, visiting a doctor, or commuting, are complicated by the presence of a border station just a few minutes down the road. Yet, like Baarle, the community has embraced its unusual situation. Some residents enjoy the quiet isolation. Others relish the oddity of living in a geographical loophole. What unites these strange borders is the way they highlight the artificiality of the lines that divide us. None of them are the result of natural features like mountains or rivers. Instead, they are the products of history, treaties, mistakes, or compromises that solidified into permanent arrangements. Baarle is a relic of medieval feudalism, Bir Tawil the legacy of colonial bureaucracy, and Point Roberts the consequence of an overzealous desire for a perfectly straight border. They remind us that borders are as much stories as they are lines, with each quirk containing layers of history and human decision-making. They also reveal the adaptability of the people who live with them. For the residents of Baarle, crossing an international border is as normal as crossing the street. For those in Point Roberts, navigating two countries is simply part of daily life. And while no one lives permanently in Bir Tawil, its existence has inspired a curious fascination with the idea of land beyond the reach of any state. These places may be anomalies, but they're also windows into the broader reality that borders are not immutable laws of nature, but human inventions capable of creating some of the oddest situations imaginable. In their weirdness, they are oddly reassuring. If borders can produce such puzzles, then perhaps they are not as fixed and rigid as they sometimes appear. They can shift, adapt, and even produce places that make us smile with their strangeness. And for a world often too serious about its dividing lines, that might be the most refreshing lesson of all. Cities are usually thought of as places that bring people together. They are hubs of commerce, culture, and community, where ideas mix as freely as the crowds in the marketplace. But in some cases, cities themselves become fault lines, their streets cut in two by borders that turn neighbors into foreigners. Few stories capture this strange reality better than Berlin, Jerusalem, and Nicosia. Three urban centers whose histories reveal the human cost and sometimes the resilience of living in divided spaces. Berlin is perhaps the most famous divided city of the 20th century. After the Second World War, Germany was carved into zones of occupation controlled by the victorious Allies. The capital, Berlin, though deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, was itself split into sectors managed by the Soviets, Americans, British, and later the French. As tensions hardened into the Cold War, Berlin became a symbol of the clash between East and West in 1961. This tension quite literally solidified when the East German government, with Soviet backing, constructed the Berlin Wall. This was not a simple fence. It became a complex barrier of concrete walls, barbed wire, guard towers, and patrol zones, slicing the city into east and west. Almost overnight, families found themselves separated, sometimes with only a few hundred meters of wall between them, yet unable to cross. Streets that once ran seamlessly across the city now ended in dead ends. Windows facing the border were bricked up, and even cemeteries were divided with graves stranded on either side of the wall. The wall was officially intended to prevent East Germans from fleeing to the west, but it also stood as a stark physical metaphor for the Iron Curtain dividing Europe. And yet, in its strangeness, the wall inspired incredible human stories. There were daring escapes over barbed wire, through tunnels dug beneath the wall, even in hot air balloons stitched together from scraps of cloth. For those who lived in West Berlin, the wall was a daily reminder of their isolation, a democratic island marooned inside a communist state. For East Berliners, it was a daily prison wall. When it finally fell in 1989, the celebrations were not just about political change, but about the healing of a city scarred by concrete. Jerusalem, on the other hand, tells a longer and more layered tale of division. This city has been fought over, conquered, destroyed, and rebuilt countless times across millennia. Its streets echo with the footsteps of prophets, crusaders, merchants, and modern armies. Division in Jerusalem is not marked by one wall, but by centuries of contested claims. After the creation of Israel in 1948, the city was split between Israeli-held West Jerusalem and Jordanian-controlled East Jerusalem, divided by barbed wire and checkpoints. The Old City, with its sacred sites, the Western Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque lay in the Jordanian sector, cut off from Israelis. In 1967, after the Six-Day War, Israel captured East Jerusalem and declared the city unified under its rule. Yet unity on paper has never erased the reality of division. The city remains one of the most sensitive flashpoints in global politics. Different communities live side by side, yet often in separate worlds, with a language, religion, and politics creating invisible but powerful borders. Jerusalem's story shows that division is not always about fences and guard towers. Sometimes it is about overlapping identities that resist neat separation, making the whole city a patchwork of belonging and exclusion. Then there is Nicosia, the capital of Cyprus, which today holds the title of being the last divided capital in Europe. The island of Cyprus has long been contested, but the modern divide dates back to 1974 when a coup supported by Greece triggered a Turkish military intervention. The result was a partition of the island with Turkish Cypriots in the north and Greek Cypriots in the south. Nicosia, lying near the middle, was split in two by a buffer, a zone patrolled by United Nations peacekeepers. The so-called Green Line cuts right through the heart of the city. On one side is the Republic of Cyprus. On the other, the Turkish-controlled north, recognized only by Turkey itself. In between lies a strange liminal space of abandoned buildings, overgrown streets, and checkpoints. For decades, crossing between the two sides was impossible. Families were separated and whole neighborhoods were frozen in time. Their shops and homes left to decay in the no-man's land. In the early 2000s, some checkpoints were opened, and today it is possible to walk from one side of Nicosia to the other. The experience is surreal. One moment, you are strolling through narrow streets filled with Greek Cypriot cafes and shops, and after a few minutes and a passport check, you emerge into Turkish Cypriot streets with different languages, currencies, and rhythms of life. It is a city within a city. And though the barriers are lower than in the past, the sense of division lingers. What links Berlin, Jerusalem, and Nicosia is the way division reshapes urban life at the most intimate level. It changes how people move, who they meet, and even how they think about their identity. A city divided is not simply two places stitched together awkwardly. It becomes a new kind of organism, one whose streets carry both the pulse of daily life and the weight of geopolitical struggle. There is also a peculiar irony in divided cities. They highlight how artificial borders truly are. A line that separates families in Berlin, a checkpoint that bisects a neighborhood in Nicosia or a contested district in Jerusalem shows that geography alone does not explain division. It is politics, fear, memory, and ambition that carve up a shared space into pieces. And yet, in all three examples, life finds a way to continue. People still go to work, share meals, celebrate festivals, and tell stories even when they must do so under the shadow of separation. Divided cities remind us of the resilience of human communities, but also of the fragility of peace. Walls may fall like in Berlin. Checkpoints may open as in Nicosia. And in Jerusalem, divisions may persist in forms that no single treaty can easily resolve. These urban landscapes and microcosms of larger struggles, but also of the possibility, however faint, of reunion. They are places where geography and politics meet in the most personal of ways, where the line on a map is not just an abstraction, but the street outside your door. The sea looks boundless. Stand at the edge of an ocean and the horizon seems infinite, stretching without interruption. Waves roll in, tides shift, gulls wheel overhead, and everything suggests freedom. But beneath that illusion of openness lies one of the most complex systems of borders humans have ever created. Unlike mountains or rivers, maritime borders are invisible, written not on the earth, but on water. They're products of treaties, measurements, and negotiations, and they shape who can fish where, who can drill for oil, and even who controls the seabed far below the waves. For much of history, the ocean was considered a kind of common property. No single ruler could hope to control vast seas, and so the idea prevailed that the waters were free to all. This principle, known as mare liberum, the freedom of the seas, was articulated in the early 17th century by the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius. It suited the great seafaring powers, particularly the Dutch, who wanted access to lucrative trade routes across the world. But the reality was less straightforward. Coastal states often tried to assert control over nearby waters, especially for fishing. As early as the Middle Ages, Scandinavian kings declared rights over herring fisheries, while England and France fought bitterly over access to waters around the Channel. By the 20th century, the growth of modern navies, international trade, and above all, the discovery of valuable resources beneath the seabed made it impossible to leave the oceans as a legal free-for-all. In 1982, after decades of debate, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, often shortened to UNCLOS, was established. This treaty created a framework for maritime borders that is still used today. Under its rules, a country controls the waters extending 12 nautical miles from its coast as territorial seas. Within this belt, the state exercises full sovereignty just as it does on land. Beyond that lies the Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, stretching up to 200 nautical miles from the shore. Within this area, the coastal state has special rights to exploit resources, particularly fisheries, oil, and gas. Even though the waters themselves remain international for navigation, on a map, these zones look simple enough. Neat arcs of circles drawn around coastlines. But the real world, with its overlapping peninsulas, scattered islands and crowded seas, rarely offers such clarity. Imagine two countries separated by fewer than 400 nautical miles. Their exclusive economic zones overlap, and suddenly both claim the same patch of sea. In such cases, negotiations and sometimes disputes determine where the line falls. It is no wonder that some of the world's most heated territorial disagreements involve maritime borders. Perhaps the most famous example today is the South China Sea. This expanse of water is dotted with reefs and islands, some barely more than rocks at low tide, yet they are fiercely contested. China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei all claim overlapping parts of the sea. The reason is not just fishing rights, though the waters are rich with them, but also potential reserves of oil and gas lying beneath the seabed. China's sweeping 9-line claim overlaps with the exclusive economic zones of several other states, leading to confrontations at sea, the construction of artificial islands, and ongoing tension that ripples far beyond the region. The Arctic Ocean offers another striking example. As climate change melts sea ice, new shipping routes and resource deposits are opening up. Countries bordering the Arctic, including Russia, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and the United States, have all filed competing claims to extend their continental shelves far under the sea. At stake are not only hydrocarbons, but also future control of polar shipping lanes. The race to stake claims in the far north shows that maritime borders are not just abstract lines. They are linked to the future of trade, energy, and geopolitics. Fishing has long been one of the most immediate and tangible drivers of maritime disputes. Coastal communities depend on fish stocks, and competition over dwindling resources has sparked conflicts from the North Atlantic to the Pacific. The so-called Cod Wars between Britain and Iceland in the 20th century are a vivid case. Iceland extended its fishing limits step by step from 4 to 12, then 50, and eventually 200 nautical miles, clashing with British trawlers and even the Royal Navy. At one point, Icelandic patrol boats cut the nets of British fishing vessels. The disputes were not mere squabbles over fish. They represented the assertion of new maritime rights that would later become standard under UNCLOS. Smaller-scale disputes abound as well. The line between Canada and the United States in the Gulf of Maine was bitterly contested, with both sides eager to control lucrative lobster fisheries. Japan and South Korea have long argued over fishing rights around the Dokdo or Takeshima islets. In West Africa, where fishing sustains millions of livelihoods, disputes over illegal or foreign fishing vessels regularly flare into political controversy. Invisible though these borders may be, their consequences are deeply felt in the daily lives of fishermen and coastal communities. Maritime borders are not only about conflict, they also encourage cooperation. Regional agreements manage shared resources such as tuna stocks that migrate across national exclusive economic zones. International bodies regulate shipping lanes to ensure safe passage in crowded straits like Malacca or Hormuz. In the Mediterranean, where dozens of states crowd the sea, complex treaties try to balance overlapping claims, allowing trade and navigation to continue without constant quarrels. The ocean, after all, is both a divider and a connector, demanding rules that let it serve both roles. There's also something poetic about the idea of drawing borders on water. Unlike a mountain ridge or a desert edge, the sea is in constant motion. Tides rise and fall, coastlines shift, and yet treaties insist on precise measurements to the very nautical mile. In some cases, islands only a few hundred meters wide have generated thousands of square miles of maritime claim. Rocks barely poking above the waves can become the focus of heated legal battles because whoever owns them controls the sea around them. It is a reminder of how much weight humans place on even the tiniest scraps of land when it comes to defining ownership of the ocean. Invisible though they are, maritime borders now cover nearly every corner of the seas. They determine who has the right to catch fish, who can drill for oil, and who patrols for smugglers or pirates. They mark out zones of sovereignty, where once there was only open water. They're fragile, often contested, but also necessary in a world where billions rely on the oceans for food, trade, and energy. And yet, despite all the treaties, disputes, and patrols, the ocean retains its mystery. Sail far from shore, and the horizon still stretches endlessly, indifferent to the lines drawn on charts back in offices thousands of miles away. Maritime borders reveal as much about human ambition and anxiety as they do about geography. They show our determination to divide and organize even the most fluid and shifting part of the planet. In the end, the sea belongs to no one, yet it belongs to everyone. An eternal paradox reflected in the invisible borders we continue to trace across its restless surface. Look upward on a clear day and the sky seems limitless, an endless dome stretching over mountains, forests, and seas alike. It feels like the last true wilderness, immune to the fences and markers that humans love to plant on the ground. But even here, in the open air above our heads, borders exist. They may be invisible to the eye, but they are carefully defined, regulated, and fiercely defended. Airspace has become one of the newest frontiers of sovereignty, and its story is a fascinating mix of law, technology, and imagination. The idea that a country controls the skies above it is a relatively recent invention. For most of history, there was no need to worry about who owned the air since no one could travel through it. The shift began in the 18th century with the arrival of balloons. Suddenly, humans were drifting into the heavens, floating across landscapes in ways that ignored political boundaries. In those early years, the legal questions were little more than curiosities, but they hinted at the dilemmas to come. Did a French balloonist drifting into Prussia commit a border violation? Did the air belong to everyone, or was it an extension of the ground below? The arrival of airplanes in the early 20th century made these questions impossible to ignore. Aircraft could fly across borders in minutes, carrying passengers, goods, or weapons. The First World War made it clear that control of the sky was not simply an abstract legal issue, but a matter of national defense. In 1919, the Paris Convention established that every state had complete and exclusive sovereignty over the airspace above its territory. From then on, the sky was no longer an open commons. It became an extension of the state, stretching upward just as much as outward. Defining the sovereignty, however, brought challenges. Territorial waters, for instance, extend 12 nautical miles from a country's coast. But how high does sovereignty in the sky go? Is there a ceiling? Most countries today accept that airspace extends up to where outer space begins, but that boundary is surprisingly vague. The so-called Kármán line, often placed at 100 kilometers above sea level, is commonly used. Yet it is not formally agreed upon in international law. Above that, space is considered free for all. Hence the freedom of satellites to orbit the Earth without asking permission from every country they pass over. Below that line, though, a jetliner must ask permission before crossing into foreign skies. Airspace is managed in layers. Civilian aircraft, from passenger jets to cargo planes, fly along tightly regulated corridors, overseen by air traffic control. Military aircraft, however, operate under different rules. Unauthorized entry into another state's airspace can provoke swift and sometimes dramatic responses. Fighter jets may scramble to intercept intruding planes, escorting them away or forcing them to land. These confrontations underline the seriousness with which air sovereignty is guarded. The downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007 in 1983 after it strayed into Soviet airspace was a grim reminder of the stakes involved. But not all disputes in the sky are dramatic. Many are technical or economic. For example, airlines must negotiate overflight rights to cross other countries on international routes. These agreements are crucial for global aviation. A flight from Europe to Asia might pass over half a dozen countries, each with the right to say yes or no. Without these agreements, many routes would be impossible, or they would require long detours that would add hours to flights. The system is so essential that the International Civil Aviation Organization, created in 1944, exists largely to coordinate and standardize these permissions. Then there are the quirks. Some countries, such as Switzerland and Austria, long resisted allowing noisy supersonic Concorde jets to fly overhead, forcing the aircraft to take winding routes. Overflight rights can also become political tools. During the Cold War, certain skies were firmly off limits, reflecting the tension between blocs. Even today, disputes flare. In 2017, several Arab countries closed their airspace to Qatari planes during a diplomatic rift, forcing airlines to take long detours. These restrictions show how borders in the sky, though invisible, can be as consequential as those on land or sea. There is also the matter of restricted and no-fly zones. These are areas where normal civilian flights are forbidden, either for security or safety. They might cover sensitive military bases, nuclear power plants, or even whole regions during conflicts. The United Nations has occasionally declared international no-fly zones, such as those over Iraq in the 1990s, designed to limit military activity. For pilots, the world map is filled not only with national borders, but also with patches of sky where access is limited or denied altogether. Airspace disputes can get downright peculiar when geography throws a curveball. Take Gibraltar, a tiny British territory on the southern tip of Spain. For decades, Spain disputed British control of the airspace above the rock, leading to restrictions on flights in and out of its airport. Another example lies in the South China Sea, where competing territorial claims over islands and reefs extend not just across the water, but also into the skies above. Here, air defense identification zones, areas where states demand identification from aircraft long before they reach sovereign airspace, overlap in complex and sometimes confrontational ways. The sky also highlights how technology shapes borders. Drones, for instance, have introduced a new layer of complexity. They can fly low, cross boundaries silently, and be used for purposes ranging from recreation to surveillance to combat. As drones proliferate, countries are scrambling to adjust laws, figuring out how to balance security with civilian use. The future of airspace governance will almost certainly look different from the frameworks of the 20th century. At the far edge of this discussion lies space itself. While outer space is officially free to all under the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, the line between national airspace and international space remains fuzzy. Satellites pass overhead with impunity. But what about future suborbital flights or commercial space tourism? When a spacecraft arcs over a country at 90 kilometers, is it violating sovereignty? These are questions that international law has yet to answer fully, reminding us that borders in the sky remain a work in progress. What makes borders in the sky so fascinating is their invisibility. No fence divides one country's airspace from another. There are no guard towers hovering in the clouds, and yet these borders are among the most carefully watched and most rigidly enforced in the world. Radar screens, air traffic controllers, and international treaties ensure that the invisible fabric of sovereignty above us is maintained. The next time you look up and see a jet carving a contrail across the blue, remember that its path is not random. It is carefully negotiated, weaving through a patchwork of invisible borders that stretch from horizon to horizon. In their own way, these borders are both fragile and powerful. Fragile because they depend entirely on human agreement. Powerful because they shape how the world is connected. They remind us that even the sky, which once seemed the last free space, has been drawn into humanity's endless project of defining and dividing territory. And as we look further outward towards space, it is worth asking, how high do borders really go? Few things reshape the world as dramatically as war. When the guns fall silent and the treaties are signed, the maps that once seemed permanent are suddenly out of date. Borders which might have stood for generations are redrawn with the sweep of a pen or the stroke of a diplomat's ruler. The 20th century, in particular, offers striking examples of this process, from the Versailles settlement after the First World War through the upheavals of the Second World War to the monumental changes that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. Each of these moments shows how fragile and malleable borders can be when caught in the currents of history. The First World War devastated Europe, tearing apart empires and exposing old rivalries. When it ended in 1918, the victorious Allied powers faced the enormous task of reshaping the continent. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 was the most famous of the resulting agreements, though in truth, it was part of a whole series of settlements that redrew Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once sprawling across Central and Eastern Europe, was dismantled into smaller nation-states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire, long called the sick man of Europe, lost nearly all its territory outside Anatolia, paving the way for modern Turkey and leaving the Middle East to be partitioned into British and French mandates. Germany suffered the harshest treatment under Versailles. Stripped of territories such as Alsace-Lorraine, forced to return land to the newly reborn Poland, and deprived of overseas colonies, Germany's borders were squeezed. The treaty also created new arrangements such as the Free City of Danzig, a semi-independent entity under League of Nations oversight. These changes aimed to create a more stable Europe, but in practice they left deep resentment. National minorities often found themselves on the wrong side of new borders, sparking tensions that would linger for decades. The Versailles borders were drawn with ideals of self-determination in mind. Yet the patchwork result often ignored local realities. Only 2 decades later, Europe's map was shaken again. The Second World War began with Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939, a move that itself was tied to border disputes. Hitler sought to reclaim Danzig and expand into territories he considered rightfully German. As the war unfolded, borders were repeatedly shifted by conquest and occupation. Nazi Germany annexed Austria, absorbed Czechoslovakia, and pushed eastward, while the Soviet Union occupied the Baltic states and parts of Finland, Poland, and Romania. When the war ended in 1945, the task of remaking borders resumed with even greater force. Germany was divided into zones of occupation, which soon hardened into East and West Germany, separated by the infamous Iron Curtain. Poland was shifted westward. It lost territory to the Soviet Union in the east, but gained formerly German lands in the west, including Silesia and Pomerania. Millions of people were displaced in one of the largest forced migrations in history. As Germans were expelled from areas that became Polish or Czech, the Soviet Union consolidated its hold on Eastern Europe, drawing new boundaries that created satellite states within its sphere of influence. The effects reached far beyond Europe. Japan lost its overseas empire, with Korea divided into Soviet and American zones at the 38th parallel, a line that hardened into the boundary between North and South Korea. In the Middle East, post-war arrangements further complicated the legacy of earlier colonial borders, setting the stage for conflicts that continue to reverberate. The Second World War demonstrated that borders could be rewritten not once in a generation, but repeatedly, with each upheaval, leaving new scars and grievances. The final great cartographic earthquake of the 20th century came with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. For decades, the USSR had held together a vast realm stretching from Eastern Europe to Central Asia. Its borders encompassed more than 100 distinct ethnic groups, numerous languages, and an astonishing range of landscapes. When the Soviet system unraveled, the consequences were immediate. 15 new independent states emerged almost overnight. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania reasserted the independence they had briefly enjoyed between the world wars. Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova appeared as sovereign nations on the map. Further east, the Central Asian republics of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan gained independence, while the Caucasus produced Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Russia itself, now stripped of its Soviet identity, remained the largest successor state, but its borders were radically different from the imperial outlines of the USSR. The collapse of Soviet authority also destabilized existing borders. In the Caucasus, disputes erupted over regions such as Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia, where ethnic and political divisions defied the neat lines inherited from Soviet administration. In Eastern Europe, countries that had been satellite states of the USSR, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and others suddenly found themselves redefining their place in a new Europe. Germany reunited in 1990, healing a border that had split the nation for 4 decades. The European Union, growing in the wake of Soviet collapse, began to erase some of the internal frontiers that had long defined the continent, even as new divisions emerged to the east. Each of these moments, Versailles, post-war settlement of 1945, and the Soviet breakup, reveals the double-edged nature of redrawn borders. On one hand, they can create opportunities for new nations to emerge, for identities long suppressed to find expression. On the other, they often leave behind unresolved tensions, minority grievances, and contested claims that can fester into future conflicts. The border between Poland and Ukraine today, the division of Korea, the disputes in the Caucasus, all trace their roots to these redrawing moments. What is striking is how quickly the permanent can change. A generation grows up thinking of certain lines as fixed, and then in the space of a few years they are transformed. The maps in classrooms, the atlases in libraries, the mental geography of millions of people all must be revised. The redrawing of borders is not just a matter of cartography, but of lived experience. It means new passports, new languages of government, new allegiances, and often painful disruptions to everyday life. The 20th century, more than any before it, showed the instability of borders. Versailles attempted to create order from the wreckage of empire, only to sow seeds of discontent. The Second World War shattered Europe again, shifting whole nations westward and eastward like pieces on a chessboard. The Soviet collapse then dissolved one of the largest political entities in history. scattering its fragments into new sovereignties. Together, these moments remind us that borders are not eternal monuments, but living arrangements shaped by power, war, and human will. They can be redrawn with startling speed, leaving us to grapple with the consequences for generations. Some borders are quiet lines, almost invisible, where one state blends gently into another with little more than a roadside sign to mark the change. But others burn hot, smoldering with tension, patrolled by soldiers, and watched anxiously by the world. These are the frontiers where history, politics, and identity collide, producing disputes that have lasted for decades and show little sign of resolution. Among the most prominent of these are the contested border of Kashmir, the razor-sharp divide on the Korean peninsula, and the deeply entrenched conflict of Israel and Palestine. Each represents not just a line on a map, but a symbol of unresolved struggles and the fragility of peace. The region of Kashmir sits high in the Himalayas, where snow-fed rivers carve valleys and mountain passes leading to South and Central Asia. For centuries, it was a crossroads of empires, a place where Hindu, Buddhist, and Muslim cultures mingled. But when British India was partitioned in 1947 into India and Pakistan, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir became the spark of lasting conflict. Its ruler, a Hindu Maharaja, hesitated over which new nation to join, while his largely Muslim population leaned toward Pakistan. When tribal militias from Pakistan entered the territory, the Maharaja sought India's help and in exchange signed an instrument of accession, bringing Kashmir into the Indian Union. That decision triggered the First Indo-Pakistani War, and by the time the fighting ended, the region was split. India controlled roughly two-thirds of Kashmir, including the populous Kashmir Valley, while Pakistan held the rest, later divided into Gilgit-Baltistan and Azad Jammu and Kashmir. In 1962, China entered the picture, seizing the Aksai Chin Plateau from India during a brief war, leaving the territory divided three ways. Today, the so-called line of control between Indian and Pakistani-held Kashmir is one of the most militarized borders in the world. Soldiers face each other across rugged mountains. Artillery, duels sometimes erupt, and the shadow of nuclear weapons hangs over both sides. For the people of Kashmir, this means decades of uncertainty, contested identity, and lives caught between two powerful neighbors unwilling to compromise. Thousands of miles away, the Korean peninsula presents another stark frontier. At the end of the Second World War, Korea, once under Japanese rule, was divided into zones of occupation at the 38th parallel. Soviet forces in the north, American forces in the south. What was supposed to be temporary soon hardened into permanence. In 1950, the Korean War erupted, as North Korea, backed by China and the Soviet Union, invaded the South. After 3 years of brutal fighting and millions of deaths, the conflict ended not with a peace treaty, but with an armistice. The result was the creation of the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, a strip roughly 2.5 miles wide running across the peninsula. Despite its name, the DMZ is one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. Barbed wire, minefields, guard posts, and surveillance equipment line both sides, and thousands of soldiers stand ready. On the southern side, gleaming observation decks allow visitors to peer into the north, while in the north, enormous propaganda signs and villages face back. The division is so complete that families separated in the 1950s have remained apart for generations, only occasionally allowed brief reunions under strict supervision, and yet the DMZ is also a paradox. Because it has been off-limits to most human activity for over 70 years, it has become an accidental nature reserve. home to rare species of cranes, leopards, and even black bears. The same line that symbolizes hostility has preserved one of the peninsula's most pristine ecosystems. Still, the political reality remains grim. North Korea and South Korea technically remain at war. Their frontier, a place where even a small miscalculation could have enormous consequences. The third hot border between Israel and Palestine is perhaps the most complex of all, with roots stretching back over a century. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, waves of Jewish immigrants arrived in Ottoman and then British-controlled Palestine, seeking refuge and building a national homeland. Tensions with the Arab population grew, and when the United Nations proposed partitioning the territory in 1947 into separate Jewish and Arab states, conflict erupted. Israel declared independence in 1948, and neighboring Arab states invaded, beginning the First Arab-Israeli War. When the fighting ended, Israel held more territory than the UN plan had envisioned, while Jordan occupied the West Bank in East Jerusalem, and Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. The borders drawn after 1948 were never permanent, and in 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel captured the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and other territories. These lands remain at the core of the dispute. Palestinians seek them as the basis of a future state, while Israeli governments have maintained varying degrees of control, building settlements and insisting on security needs. The result is a landscape of checkpoints, barriers, and zones of contested sovereignty. In Jerusalem, sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, the question of control remains particularly fraught with neighborhoods and holy sites overlapping in a dense mosaic of faith and politics. Unlike Kashmir or Korea, where borders are at least physically defined, the Israel-Palestine conflict is marked by shifting lines that are constantly debated, negotiated, or resisted. The so-called Green Line, the armistice boundary from 1949, is often referenced, but on the ground, fences, walls, and settlements complicate the picture. For ordinary people, this means daily life shaped by permits, barriers, and the uncertainties of conflict. What unites Kashmir, Korea, and Israel-Palestine is the way borders become more than geography. They are embodiment of identity, history, and unresolved trauma. Each is a frontier where two or more national narratives collide, where compromise is elusive because the stakes are seen as existential. These are not quiet customs posts or routine passport checks, but lines of fire and symbolism where the possibility of peace is as contested as the land itself. And yet, even in these tense spaces, life goes on. In Kashmir, markets bustle beneath the Himalayas despite curfews. In South Korea, tourists snap photos of the DMZ while high-speed trains rush southward. In Jerusalem, pilgrims and residents alike crowd the streets of the old city, carrying on amidst the tensions. These hot borders remind us of both the danger and resilience of humanity, the capacity for division, and the stubborn will to endure in spite of it. They also serve as warnings. Borders drawn or hardened in times of conflict rarely fade away quickly. They linger, shaping generations, embedding mistrust and making peace a long, fragile process. When we think of borders as lines, it is easy to forget the heat they can carry. Kashmir, Korea, and Israel-Palestine show us that some borders do not simply divide space. They divide futures, locking nations into struggles where resolution seems always just beyond reach. For as long as there have been borders, there have been people trying to cross them. Sometimes the journey is voluntary, a quest for trade, opportunity, or adventure. At other times, it is born out of desperation, fleeing war, famine, persecution, or disaster. The story of refugees is as old as civilization. But in the modern world, their paths have increasingly collided with walls, fences, and bureaucratic hurdles designed to keep them out. Borders that once were hazy frontiers have hardened into barriers, and with them has come a long, complicated history of both compassion and exclusion. The 20th century turned the refugee into a global figure. Wars on an unprecedented scale pushed millions from their homes, beginning with the upheavals of the First World War. The Russian Revolution sent waves of people fleeing across Europe, while the collapse of the Ottoman Empire displaced Armenians, Greeks, and others. The interwar period saw refugees wandering the continent, stateless and often unwelcome. Then came the Second World War, which created the largest refugee crisis in history. Entire populations were uprooted as Nazi invasions, shifting borders, and the Holocaust forced tens of millions to move. By the war's end, displaced persons camps dotted Europe, housing people who no longer had countries to return to or who feared persecution if they did. It was in this context that the world began to codify refugee rights. In 1951, the United Nations Refugee Convention set out the principle of non-refoulement, that no refugee should be forced back to a country where they face persecution. This was a milestone recognizing that human dignity transcended the sovereignty of states. Yet even as the convention promised protection, nations continued to wrestle with the tension between humanitarian ideals and fears about security, resources, and identity. The Cold War added new dimensions. Refugees became political symbols as much as human beings. When Hungarians rose against Soviet control in 1956, nearly 200,000 fled westward, welcomed as heroes of anti-communism. By contrast, those escaping poverty or instability from other parts of the world often found doors less open. The Vietnamese boat people, after 1975, braved perilous seas in search of safety, their plight prompting both generous resettlement programs and fierce debates over immigration. Each wave of refugees tested the promises enshrined in international law and exposed the unevenness of their application. Parallel to these flows of people, the world began building walls. While ancient fortifications like the Great Wall of China or Hadrian's Wall were built to defend against armies, the new generation of barriers often aimed to stop individuals. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961, was one of the most notorious. It was not designed to keep invaders out, but to keep East Germans in, preventing them from fleeing to the West. For nearly 3 decades, it stood as a chilling reminder that borders could imprison as much as they protected. In the decades since its fall, walls have multiplied. The border fence between the United States and Mexico is among the most famous modern examples. Stretching hundreds of miles, it is intended to slow unauthorized migration, yet it has also become a symbol of political debate, reflecting deeper questions about identity, economy, and security. Despite its imposing appearance, migrants still find ways across through deserts, rivers, or tunnels, risking their lives in the process. The wall has not erased the pressures that drive migration, poverty, violence, and opportunity, but it has made the journey more dangerous. In Europe, new barriers have emerged in response to migration from Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Spain has fortified its enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla in North Africa, building fences topped with razor wire to deter people trying to climb over from Morocco. Hungary constructed fences along its southern border during the height of the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015, redirecting flows of people, but also sparking controversy over humanitarian obligations. Walls are no longer relics of the past. They are very much a part of the present, rising wherever states feel overwhelmed by the movement of people. And yet walls rarely stop migration altogether. Instead, they change its routes and risks. A blocked crossing point simply pushes refugees and migrants to attempt more perilous alternatives across seas in overcrowded boats, through deserts without water, or along the hands of smugglers who profit from their desperation. The Mediterranean has become one of the world's deadliest migration routes, with thousands of people drowning each year as they try to reach Europe. In this way, the barriers built by states often redirect the cost of migration onto the most vulnerable. The human stories behind these movements are profound. Families in Aleppo packing what they can carry before fleeing bombardment. Farmers in sub-Saharan Africa forced to move as droughts devastate their livelihoods. Young men and women crossing borders in search of work to support families left behind. Each journey is unique, but together they reveal a universal truth. People will always move when staying put means suffering or death. Borders may slow them, but they rarely stop them entirely. At the same time, refugee flows and walls expose the contradictions of globalization. Goods, money, and ideas often flow freely across borders. But people face barriers. A container ship filled with electronics can cross oceans with ease, while a person fleeing war struggles to find safe passage. This imbalance highlights the way borders have become filters, letting some things pass while blocking others. There is also a paradox in the fact that walls, though designed to divide, often become points of contact. At the U.S.-Mexico border, families meet through steel slats to talk and touch fingers, creating scenes both heartbreaking and defiant. In places like Bethlehem, the separation barrier has been turned into a canvas for art and protest, transforming a wall of division into a space for expression. Even as they divide, these structures reveal the human desire to connect across them. The history of refugees and walls is a reminder that borders are not static. They shift with political winds, with wars, with the movement of people themselves. Refugees challenge the very idea of fixed sovereignty by embodying the reality that safety and belonging do not always align with national boundaries. Walls, for all their imposing presence, cannot erase this truth. They are temporary attempts to hold back a tide that is ultimately human in nature. From the displaced millions of the Second World War to the perilous crossings of today, the story of refugees is inseparable from the story of borders, and in that story, one lesson emerges again and again. Walls may be high, fences may be sharp, but the movement of people is a constant of history, as enduring as the desire for a safer, better life. Borders are often drawn with the promise of order. They are meant to regulate who and what passes from one side to the other, whether it is a traveler with a passport, a shipment of goods, or a simple letter. But wherever rules are written, people find ways around them. Alongside official trade routes and customs posts, there has always been a shadow world of smugglers, clandestine crossings, and underground markets. Borders do not just divide nations, they create opportunities for those willing to exploit the gaps. From ancient merchants sneaking contraband past tax collectors to modern networks moving everything from cigarettes to weapons, smuggling has been an enduring companion to the story of borders. At its core, smuggling thrives on difference. Whenever two sides of a border have unequal laws, prices, or resources, there is an incentive to move goods secretly. In medieval Europe, salt was one of the most heavily taxed commodities. Entire communities of smugglers made a living by slipping sacks of the precious mineral across frontiers under the cover of night. In China, during the Ming Dynasty, prohibitions on private overseas trade led to a flourishing black market along the coast with pirates and merchants exchanging silks and silver beyond the watch of imperial officials. The line between outlaw and entrepreneur was often blurry. Smugglers were despised by rulers but quietly relied upon by ordinary people who benefited from cheaper goods. Colonial empires saw smuggling on a grand scale. In the 18th century, Britain sought to control trade in the Americas through its navigation acts, requiring colonies to trade only with the mother country. Unsurprisingly, many colonists turned to smuggling to acquire French wines, Dutch textiles, or Caribbean sugar. George Washington himself once complained about customs duties. And John Hancock, later a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was famously accused of smuggling molasses. What empires called illegal, colonists often called necessity. And in many ways, smuggling helped fuel resentment against imperial control. In the modern world, smuggling has become more varied and more global. The most obvious examples involve narcotics. The vast networks of drug cartels moving cocaine from South America, heroin from Afghanistan, or synthetic drugs from laboratories across Asia are the stuff of headlines and movies. But behind this sensationalism lies a simple truth. Borders make profitable barriers. A kilo of cocaine may cost only a few $1,000s in Colombia, but by the time it is smuggled into the United States or Europe, its value multiplies many times over. The risk of crossing borders, evading patrols, bribing officials, concealing goods is exactly what makes the trade so lucrative. Yet drugs are only one part of the picture. Cigarette smuggling is one of the most widespread and underestimated shadow economies. Where taxes make legal cigarettes expensive, smugglers swoop in to supply cheaper alternatives. In parts of Eastern Europe and North Africa, illicit tobacco sales make up a significant portion of the market, depriving governments of billions in revenue. Alcohol, too, has often been a target. During America's Prohibition era in the 1920s, bootleggers smuggled whiskey across the Canadian border or rum through the Caribbean, fueling the rise of organized crime. Borders were less lines of defense than opportunities for creativity, as smugglers built hidden compartments in cars, designed false bottom barrels, and even used small planes to ferry contraband over patrols. Smuggling also extends beyond goods into people. Human smuggling has grown into a vast global business driven by demand from migrants desperate to escape conflict, poverty, or persecution. Networks operate across the Sahara, the Mediterranean, Central America, and Southeast Asia, charging thousands of dollars to move people across borders. While sometimes these smugglers provide a lifeline, more often they exploit vulnerability, packing migrants into dangerous boats or desert trucks with little regard for their safety. Tragedies at sea or in suffocating containers highlight the human cost of this shadow economy. Yet as long as legal avenues for migration remain limited, smuggling networks will find business. There's also the world of arms smuggling, a trade that has fueled conflicts from West Africa to the Middle East. Borders in these regions are often porous, with desert routes or jungle trails allowing weapons to flow from one conflict zone to another. The illegal circulation of small arms has prolonged wars and made peace settlements fragile, with smugglers acting as the lifeline for rebel movements and criminal gangs alike. For governments, sealing these flows is a constant struggle, often beyond their capacity. But not all smuggling is about danger and crime. Sometimes it emerges from the simplest human desires. In Berlin during the Cold War, West Berliners smuggled radios, books, and even chocolate into East Berlin for friends and relatives. In divided Korea, the smuggling of South Korean soap operas, music, and films into the North has become a quiet cultural rebellion. These acts show that smuggling is not only about profit. It can also be about defiance, about breaking through the artificial walls that separate societies. Borders themselves shape the methods of smugglers. In deserts, caravans slip past patrols at night, following routes known for centuries. Along coasts, speedboats or even semi-submersibles dart through waves to deliver their cargo. Mountain borders see mules and hidden trails pressed into service just as they did centuries ago. In modern airports, smugglers resort to false luggage, body concealment, or increasingly creative techniques to bypass scanners. Technology and counter-technology evolve in tandem, with customs officers constantly devising new methods of detection and smugglers constantly seeking to outwit them. The presence of smuggling also reminds us of the limits of borders. No matter how high a fence is built, no matter how sophisticated the surveillance, people find ways to cross. Smugglers exploit not only geography, but also human weaknesses, corruption, greed, or simply the desire to look the other way. In many places, local communities even depend on smuggling. On the frontier between Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, the contraband trade in electronics and other goods is woven into the local economy. In parts of North Africa, fuel smuggling across borders is a vital source of income. For those living on the margins, the shadow economy is not just criminal, but necessary for survival. It is tempting to think of smugglers as villains, and often they are, but history shows a more nuanced picture. They're also opportunists, rebels, and sometimes folk heroes. In folklore, the smuggler is often romanticized, clever, daring, outwitting the authorities. Ballads in England celebrated coastal smugglers who brought in forbidden brandy or tea, painting them as champions against unfair taxes. In reality, the line between outlaw and benefactor has always depended on perspective. What the state sees as illegal, ordinary people may see as resourceful. In the end, the shadow economies of borders tell us as much about the rules as they do about the rule breakers. Smuggling flourishes wherever borders create sharp contrasts in wealth, law, or opportunity. It is a mirror held up to the global system, exposing its inequalities and contradictions. Whether it is salt in the Middle Ages, rum during Prohibition, or smartphones today, the goods may change, but the impulse remains the same. Where there is a line, someone will try to cross it unseen. Borders are meant to separate, but smugglers show that they can also connect. They weave hidden networks across divides, sometimes destructive, sometimes defiant, but always a reminder that no frontier is ever truly airtight. In the shadows cast by walls and customs posts, another economy thrives. A borderland world that lives by its own rules, always moving, always adapting, as old as borders themselves. Borders are often portrayed as stark dividing lines, firm boundaries that separate one nation from another. But if you stand in many border regions, the picture looks very different. Instead of rigid walls, you find bridges of culture, with music, food, language, and traditions flowing freely from one side to the other. The frontier, far from being a place of separation, often becomes a meeting ground, where identities blur and blend into something new. These border cultures remind us that geography may divide, but people find ways to share. One of the clearest examples is the long frontier between the United States and Mexico. On a map, it's a firm boundary stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Pacific to the Gulf of Mexico. In reality, it has given rise to a vibrant cultural zone known as the borderlands. Here, Spanish and English intertwine in Spanglish, a language that flows with ease between two worlds. Food fuses, too, producing Tex-Mex cuisine where tacos meet chili con carne and enchiladas sit alongside barbecue. Music echoes with a similar hybrid energy as Mexican mariachi blends with American country and rock. Cities like El Paso and Ciudad Juarez face each other across the Rio Grande, tied together by family, commerce, and culture, despite the fences and checkpoints. Another rich border culture exists along the line dividing India and Pakistan in Punjab. The border itself at Wagah is marked by a famously theatrical daily ceremony where soldiers from both sides perform elaborate drills stamping their boots and lowering their flags with exaggerated flair. Yet beyond the pageantry, shared traditions bind people together. Punjabi language and music thrive on both sides, and the rhythms of Bhangra dance pulse equally in Lahore and Amritsar. Families separated by partition in 1947 often still share the same foods, jokes, and songs passed down despite political hostilities. In villages straddling the frontier, cultural continuity is stronger than the dividing line might suggest. In Africa, colonial borders often cut across traditional communities, creating nations that contain pieces of many ethnic groups. Along the frontier between Kenya and Tanzania, for example, the Maasai people move with their cattle across lands they have roamed for centuries, indifferent to the modern boundary. Their culture, red shuka cloth, beadwork, and age-old rituals exist on both sides, reminding us that national lines drawn in European conference rooms never erased indigenous traditions. Similarly, the Tuareg of the Sahara, known as the Blue People for the dye of their robes, travel across Mali, Niger, Algeria, and Libya, maintaining cultural identity that transcends any passport. Europe, too, offers countless examples of shared traditions along borders. In the Basque Country, spanning northern Spain and southwestern France, the Basques have preserved their own language, euskera, and distinctive cultural practices across centuries. Festivals, sports such as pelota, and distinctive cuisine unite communities regardless of which side of the Pyrenees they reside. The Alps provide another illustration. Italians, Swiss, Austrians, and French living in alpine valleys have for generations shared cheese-making traditions, dialects, and seasonal rituals tied to the mountains, making the borders between them more symbolic than practical in daily life. Some of the most fascinating border cultures emerged not from ancient traditions, but from the act of living between two worlds. Hong Kong, once a British colony, now integrated with China, developed a unique hybrid culture mixing Cantonese traditions with British institutions. Similarly, Macau, influenced by centuries of Portuguese presence, developed its own fusion of European and Chinese architecture, food, and festivals. These places demonstrate how borders, whether colonial or modern, often produce unexpected cultural blends that enrich rather than diminish identity. In Eastern Europe, where frontiers have shifted repeatedly, shared traditions often linger even when borders change. The region of Transylvania, now in Romania, has long been home to Hungarians, Romanians, Saxons, and others, each contributing to a layered cultural landscape of folk tales, music, and architecture. Borderlands here are less about division and more about coexistence, even if sometimes uneasy. Markets and fairs draw people from both sides, and local cuisine reveals influences from every direction, even in places of conflict. Border cultures persist along the line dividing Israel and Palestine. Shared foods like hummus, falafel, and flatbreads transcend politics, reminding everyone of common roots. In Cyprus, divided between Greek and Turkish communities, music and dance show striking similarities despite decades of separation. Culture seeps across walls carried in memory, sound, and taste, often more powerful than barriers meant to divide. Border cultures also thrive in language. In many regions, bilingualism is not a luxury, but a necessity. Along the Swiss-Italian border, dialects slip easily between Italian and Romansh or German, depending on context. In Belgium's frontier towns, Flemish and French intermingle in casual conversation. And on the Canadian-American border, communities like those in Quebec and Vermont have long navigated French and English, producing a unique blend of accents and expressions. These linguistic overlaps highlight how people adapt to their geography, turning potential division into richness. The persistence of shared traditions also reflects resilience. Political borders may change overnight, but cultural memory endures. Families pass down recipes, songs, and stories that ignore the map. Festivals continue on both sides, sometimes even celebrated jointly. In some areas, such as the Sami lands across Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, indigenous traditions have gained new recognition, demonstrating how border cultures can be preserved even in the face of modern state systems. There is a kind of poetry in the way border cultures form. They are born from exchange, compromise, and improvisation. They show that identity is not static but fluid, able to absorb influences and reframe them as something new. At the same time, they remind us that borders are human inventions. While they may shape laws and politics, they cannot fully contain the rhythms of daily life. The irony is that borders designed to separate often create the conditions for cultural blending. When two worlds meet, they rub against each other, sparking creativity. Music borrows rhythms, cuisine blends flavors, and language evolves into hybrids. What emerges is neither entirely one thing nor the other, but something unique to the borderland itself. In the end, border cultures are testaments to human adaptability. They reveal that people, no matter how divided by politics, will always find ways to connect through what they eat, speak, sing, and celebrate. These shared traditions blur the lines on maps, reminding us that life cannot be neatly boxed into categories of nation and state. Borders may exist, but culture flows as freely as rivers and winds, refusing to be confined. Some cities sit comfortably in the middle of a nation, far from frontiers, with their rhythms shaped mostly by the life within their own boundaries. Others, however, live on the edge, pressed up against borders shaped by the push and pull of different worlds. These border cities become crossroads where identities overlap, economies intertwine, and contradictions are part of daily life. Tijuana, Hong Kong, and Istanbul are three such places, each uniquely shaped by their position at the hinge of nations and cultures. Tijuana, on Mexico's northern edge, lies cheek by jowl with the sprawling metropolis of San Diego. On one side of the fence lies the United States, with its suburbs, malls, and freeways. On the other, Tijuana buzzes with its own chaotic vibrancy. The border here is among the busiest in the world, with tens of millions of crossings each year. For many, the daily commute between Tijuana and San Diego is routine. People live in one city and work or study in the other. The frontier is not just a barrier, but a shared archery of life. Tijuana's culture reflects this constant exchange. The city is famous for its nightlife, its tacos, and its music, all of which have been shaped by the steady flow of people and ideas across the border. It has also long been a place of reinvention, where migrants from across Mexico and Latin America arrive hoping to cross into the United States or else settle in Tijuana itself, adding to its dynamic mix. This constant movement has made the city resilient and adaptable. Yet the proximity to the border also brings challenges. Tijuana has found itself tied, to the fortunes of migration politics, drug trafficking routes, and economic disparities. Still, it thrives as a place where two worlds are in constant conversation, producing a city unlike any other in Mexico. On the other side of the Pacific lies Hong Kong, a city whose very identity has been forged by borders and transitions. For more than 150 years, it was a British colony, leased and ruled separately from mainland China. During that time, it developed a hybrid culture, Cantonese at its roots, yet deeply influenced by British law, education, and governance. Its architecture reflected this blend with colonial-era buildings standing beside Chinese temples, and its cuisine became a celebrated fusion of East and West. In 1997, the United Kingdom returned Hong Kong to China under the One Country, Two Systems framework. This arrangement granted Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy, maintaining its legal and economic systems while acknowledging Chinese sovereignty. The result was that Hong Kong became a border city, not just physically, but politically, part of China, yet distinct in its freedoms and institutions. This unusual position allowed it to flourish as a financial hub, linking global capital with the vast markets of the mainland. Yet being a border city has also meant tension. The lines between autonomy and integration have blurred in recent years, sparking protests and debates over the city's future. Hong Kong shows how a border city can be both a bridge and a battleground, a place where different systems meet in ways that create both opportunity and conflict. It remains a striking example of how borders are not always fixed lines, but can live within the very fabric of a city itself. Istanbul, by contrast, is a city defined by geography in the most dramatic way. Straddling the Bosporus Strait, it quite literally sits at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. A ferry ride across the water is also a journey between continents. Though for residents the crossing is so routine, it feels as natural as commuting across town. This continental divide has made Istanbul one of the most historically significant border cities in the world. For centuries, it was the capital of empires. First Byzantium, then Constantinople under the Romans and Byzantines, and later the seat of the Ottoman sultans. Its position made it a jewel coveted by conquerors and a gateway between worlds. That legacy still permeates the city. Its skyline is dotted with minarets and domes, but also with modern skyscrapers. The Grand Bazaar bustles with traders as it has for centuries, while contemporary art galleries showcase Istanbul's global outlook. In neighborhoods, you find influences from across the Mediterranean, the Balkans, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Istanbul is not just a city with a border. It is itself a border embodying the meeting of cultures and continents in every street and square. What unites Tijuana, Hong Kong, and Istanbul is the way their locations have made them both vibrant and vulnerable. Their economies thrive on exchange, but they also face the pressures of politics that ripple across frontiers. Tijuana is tied to the debates over immigration and trade between Mexico and the United States. Hong Kong reflects the delicate balance of sovereignty and autonomy in modern China. Istanbul continues to navigate its role as a bridge between East and West, carrying both the advantages and burdens of that position. These cities reveal how borders are not only lines to be crossed, but also places to be lived in. The daily life of a border city is marked by contrasts, currencies that mingle, languages that overlap, cuisines that fuse, and sometimes tensions that flare. They are spaces where the artificial lines of politics meet the organic flows of culture, creating unique hybrids that could not exist anywhere else. In the end, border cities stand as reminders of the creativity that comes from proximity. They may live under the shadow of fences, checkpoints, or contested sovereignties, but they also demonstrate how human energy flourishes where worlds collide. Whether it is the nightlife of Tijuana, the skyline of Hong Kong, or the historic grandeur of Istanbul, these cities show that living on the edge of borders often means living at the center of culture. There was a time when moving across borders was as simple as walking or riding from one town to the next. Medieval merchants might carry letters of introduction, and pilgrims might show tokens to prove their purpose. But the idea of every traveler needing a standardized document would have seemed absurd. Today, however, the passport has become one of the most powerful little booklets in the world. The key to mobility, identity, and sovereignty. Alongside it stand checkpoints, those choke points of modern life where documents, faces, and sometimes even intentions are inspected before one is allowed to pass. The rise of passports and checkpoints tells a story of how states learned to control not only their land, but the very movement of people across it. Passports in their earliest forms were not what we know today. In the Persian Empire, long before the Common Era, royal officials issued letters granting safe passage through the king's territory. The Hebrew Bible even mentioned such a practice with Nehemiah, receiving letters from the Persian king to travel safely. In medieval Europe, similar documents appeared. Not standard passports for all, but permissions granted to particular individuals, often merchants, diplomats, or nobles. These were less about proving identity and more about declaring that the traveler enjoyed protection under some authority. The modern passport emerged slowly in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Industrialization and railways made travel faster and more common, while states grew more interested in regulating who crossed their borders. The First World War provided the decisive push. Governments introduced passports and visas as a way to track movement, prevent espionage, and maintain control during wartime. When the war ended, these controls did not disappear. Instead, they hardened into permanent systems. By the 1920s, the League of Nations helped standardize passport formats, giving rise to the little booklet familiar today. The passport's power lies not just in proving who you are, but in determining where you can go. Not all passports are created equal. Some open doors to nearly every corner of the world with minimal bureaucracy, while others can find their holders with visa requirements and restrictions. A traveler from Japan or Germany may breeze through airports across continents, while someone with a passport from Afghanistan or Syria faces daunting barriers. This hierarchy of mobility reflects global inequalities, making the passport one of the most telling documents of our age. Checkpoints, meanwhile, embody the physical side of control. At their simplest, they are places where documents are checked before one crosses from one jurisdiction to another, but they can range from casual roadside inspections to imposing complexes of gates, scanners, and armed guards. The experience of a checkpoint can be mundane. A quick stamp in a passport, at a sleepy border crossing, or tense, as at the heavily militarized post between Israel and the West Bank, or along the Korean demilitarized zone. Some checkpoints have become iconic in their own right. During the Cold War, Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin symbolized the division of East and West. Tourists today still pose for photos there, though the armed confrontation that once made it a global flashpoint is gone. In Jerusalem, the Kalandia checkpoint has become a daily reality for Palestinians commuting between the West Bank and the city, a place where the politics of borders are felt in queues, inspections, and delays. The very word checkpoint evokes the intersection of bureaucracy and human experience where the power of the state meets the vulnerability of the individual. Technology has transformed both passports and checkpoints. Biometric data, fingerprints, iris scans, facial recognition is increasingly built into passports and used at border gates. Automated e-gates at airports allow travelers to pass with little human interaction, provided their data matches precisely. For many, this has streamlined travel, reducing long waits. For others, particularly those whose features do not scan easily or whose names trigger watch lists, the system introduces new frustrations and exclusions. The rise of digital identity has made crossing borders faster, but also more intrusive, raising questions about privacy and surveillance. The very need for passports reflects a shift in how states view mobility. In earlier times, movement was often assumed and less specifically prohibited. Today, movement across borders is generally forbidden unless specifically authorized. The burden of proof lies on the traveler to demonstrate who they are and why they are crossing. This inversion has made the passport not just a travel document, but a symbol of belonging. Without one, a person may find themselves effectively locked out of the global system, unable to travel, work, or sometimes even return home. Stateless people, lacking recognized passports, live with this limbo, their identities unanchored in the world of official documentation. Passports and checkpoints also carry a curious duality. On one hand, they represent security, the idea that borders are managed and threats filtered. On the other, they represent exclusion, the closing of doors. A border crossing can be a moment of relief, a sense of safety upon entering one's own country. But it can just as easily be a moment of anxiety. As an official scrutinizes a document, questions pile up and the fate of the traveler rests on a stamp or a nod. Some places experiment with removing checkpoints altogether. The European Union's Schengen area is perhaps the most famous example, allowing citizens of member states to cross borders without showing passports. And for travelers, it feels almost miraculous to drive from France into Germany or from Spain into Portugal without a pause. Yet this freedom exists only because the EU members have agreed on shared external border controls. The absence of checkpoints inside is made possible by more rigorous management of the edges. It is a reminder that openness in one place often requires stricter controls in another. Passports also hold symbolic power. They are tokens of nationality, small books that condense identity into a set of stamps, holograms, and emblems. Some people take pride in the design of their passport covers with motifs that showcase cultural heritage. Others view theirs with frustration, aware of the limits it places on their freedom. In both cases, the passport is a reminder that in the modern world, identity is not just personal, but political, encoded into an object that determines one's mobility. Ultimately, passports and checkpoints reveal the paradox of our age. We live in a world more interconnected than ever, with goods and information flowing rapidly across borders. Yet the movement of people remains tightly regulated. The small booklet in a pocket and the barrier at a border post embody this tension. They promise order, but also remind us of division, offering passage to some while denying it to others. What began as letters of safe passage has become a global system of control, one that quietly shapes the lives of billions. Every stamp, every gate, every question at a border crossing tells a story of how humans have learned to manage mobility. And in the end, the passport and the checkpoint remind us that in a world of nations, even the act of moving from one place to another is never just a personal journey. It is also a negotiation with the invisible power of the state. For most of human history, The idea of crossing from one country into another without stopping, without showing papers, and without even slowing down would have seemed impossible. Borders were barriers, places where rulers collected taxes, checked travelers, and guarded against enemies. And yet, in parts of the modern world, the dream of moving freely across frontiers has become a reality. Nowhere is this more striking than in Europe's Schengen zone, a region where over 400 million people can travel, as if the continent were one country. Paired with the wider forces of globalization, Schengen represents both the promise and the complexity of a world where borders seem to fade. The origins of Schengen lie not in idealism, but in practicality. In 1985, 5 European nations, Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany, signed an agreement in the small Luxembourg village of Schengen. Their aim was simple: to remove border controls between them and make travel easier. At the time, the European community was focused mainly on economics, but these 5 countries took a step further, deciding that people as well as good should flow freely. 10 years later, the agreement came into full effect, and the Schengen zone was born. Today, the Schengen area covers 27 European states, stretching from Portugal in the west to Finland in the north and Greece in the south. Travelers can drive, cycle, or walk across these borders without ever presenting a passport. A train can roll from Paris to Berlin or from Vienna to Budapest with no interruptions, as if the continent was sewn together by invisible threads. For Europeans, this has become such an ordinary part of life that it is easy to forget how extraordinary it truly is. The impact on daily life has been profound. Students study abroad with ease. Workers commute across borders as casually as others cross town. And tourists can explore entire regions without worrying about checkpoints. For many border towns, Schengen has meant revival, with commerce flourishing and families once separated by fences now seamlessly reunited. In some ways, it has restored the natural rhythms of communities that long predated modern nation-states. Rivers and valleys that were once divided by treaties now serve as shared spaces again. But the Schengen dream is not just about convenience. It is also a powerful symbol of trust. By abolishing internal borders, member states agree to rely on one another to guard the external frontier. If someone enters through Spain, they can, in theory, travel unhindered all the way to Poland. This makes Schengen a bold experiment in collective responsibility, where the security of one becomes the security of all. It is an arrangement built not on walls, but on cooperation. Globalization has taken this vision further. Around the world, borders have not disappeared, but they have become increasingly porous to flows of goods, money, and information. Container ships glide across oceans. Stock exchanges are linked in real time, and ideas move instantly through digital networks. A T-shirt might be designed in Italy, stitched in Bangladesh, shipped from Singapore, and sold in Canada, all without the average consumer thinking twice about the borders it has crossed. For many, globalization has made the world feel smaller. Air travel allows someone to breakfast in London and dine in New York. Smartphones mean a conversation between Lagos and Tokyo is as easy as chatting with a neighbor. Cultural exchange has accelerated too, with films, food, and fashions leaping across frontiers at dizzying speed. In this sense, Schengen is simply the European version of a broader global trend, the erosion of borders as barriers to human connection. Yet the story is not entirely one of unity and freedom. Schengen and globalization both come with tensions. During the migrant crisis of 2015, several Schengen states temporarily reintroduced border checks, struggling to manage the influx of people seeking asylum. The COVID-19 pandemic brought another shock with barriers and health checks springing up across Europe, reminding everyone that borders never disappear entirely, even in the most integrated regions. Trust, it turns out, can falter under pressure. Globalization, too, has sparked anxieties. Factories close as jobs move overseas. Cultural identities feel diluted, and governments worry about losing control to forces beyond their borders. Critics argue that while goods and capital flow freely, people often do not, leaving inequalities entrenched. In this way, globalization has produced both new opportunities and new fractures. Still, the dream of a borderless world retains its appeal. The Schengen zone shows that it is possible to dismantle barriers without collapsing into chaos. It is a reminder that borders are not immutable laws of nature, but human choices, and that with enough cooperation, they can be reshaped. Globalization, for all its flaws, has connected humanity more closely than at any other point in history, creating a web of interdependence that makes isolation almost unthinkable. The paradox is that even as borders fade in some respects, they grow sharper in others. Airports, ports, and digital systems carefully monitor who and what enters. Visa policies remain strict for non-Europeans, and not everyone benefits equally from the ease of movement. In the global economy, some countries sit at the center of networks, while others remain on the margins. The borderless dream is in many ways unevenly shared, and yet, when a traveler boards a train in Brussels and steps off in Amsterdam without noticing a border, or when a song recorded in Seoul tops the charts in Brazil, it is hard not to feel that something remarkable is unfolding. The dream may never be fully realized, but pieces of it are already here. Schengen and globalization both tell the same story, that borders, while powerful, are not absolute. They can be softened, blurred, or even removed entirely when societies choose. They reveal a future in which humanity might continue to be divided into states, but more and more connected in daily life. For now, borders remain part of our world. But the existence of the Schengen zone shows that the lines we draw are not destiny, and that sometimes the most radical border is the one that quietly disappears. The Earth's final frontiers are not deserts or jungles anymore, but oceans and ice. As climate change reshapes the planet, borders are being tested in places where few people once thought about drawing lines. Water and ice, vast, shifting, and once seemingly permanent, have become arenas of political rivalry. The Arctic Ocean is opening new shipping routes and revealing hidden resources, while low-lying islands in the Pacific and Indian Oceans face the terrifying possibility of disappearing beneath the waves altogether. In both cases, the future of borders may depend not on what humans want, but on what the climate decides. The Arctic has always held a kind of mythical allure. For centuries, explorers dreamed of finding a northern passage through its frozen seas, a shortcut linking Europe to Asia. Most turned back, defeated by the ice, though their names linger on maps: Baffin Bay, Hudson Strait, Franklin's doomed expedition. But in the 21st century, as global temperatures rise and ice melts at unprecedented rates, the dream is becoming reality. The northern sea route along Russia's coast and the Northwest Passage through Canada's Arctic archipelago are both increasingly navigable during summer months. Ships that once required icebreakers now glide through waters that not long ago were solid sheets of white. This transformation has ignited a scramble for influence. Under international law, particularly the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, coastal states can claim economic rights extending 200 nautical miles from their shores. Beyond that, countries may try to extend their control by proving their continental shelves stretch further underwater. Russia, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and the United States have all staked claims in the Arctic with overlapping submissions that map makers struggle to reconcile. At the center of attention is the Lomonosov Ridge, a vast underwater mountain chain that Russia insists is an extension of its continental shelf, potentially granting it rights to huge swathes of the Arctic seabed. What makes these claims so urgent is not just geography, but resources. Beneath the ice lies an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and nearly one-third of its undiscovered natural gas. Minerals such as nickel, copper, and rare earths are also believed to be abundant. As ice retreats, these resources become increasingly accessible, and states are positioning themselves to secure them. Russia has planted a titanium flag on the seabed at the North Pole, built new military bases, and launched fleets of icebreakers to assert dominance. Canada emphasizes sovereignty through patrols and outposts, while the United States looks north with strategic caution. The Arctic, once seen as remote and uninhabitable, is now at the heart of global geopolitics. But the politics of Arctic ice extend beyond resources. New shipping lanes could cut travel times dramatically, changing the economics of global trade. A voyage from East Asia to Europe via the Northern Sea Route is thousands of miles shorter than the traditional path through the Suez Canal. For shipping companies, this means reduced costs and less fuel consumption, though the risks of unpredictable ice and harsh conditions remain. For states, it raises questions of control. Should these routes be considered international waters open to all or internal passages subject to national regulations? Russia insists the Northern Sea Route is under its jurisdiction, while others argue it should be a global commons. While the Arctic opens up, other borders face a more tragic fate. They may literally vanish. Across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, small island nations such as Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Maldives live with the daily reality of rising seas. For these countries, borders are not abstract lines, but coastlines, and those coastlines are retreating. Storm surges erode beaches. Salt water seeps into farmland, and some communities have already relocated from ancestral homes. In the most extreme scenarios, entire nations could disappear beneath the waves. This raises unprecedented legal and political questions. If an island sinks, does its exclusive economic zone disappear with it? International law has little precedent for vanished countries. Tuvalu and other vulnerable states argue that their maritime rights should persist even if their land is lost. But not all nations agree. There is also the profound question of identity. A borderless nation without land. Where does it exist? Is it in the passports its people carry in their diaspora communities or in digital archives of their culture? For those who face losing their homelands, borders are not just geopolitical boundaries, but the very definition of who they are. Some governments have begun preparing for this possibility. Kiribati has purchased land in Fiji as a potential refuge. The Maldives has raised international alarm, hosting underwater cabinet meetings to dramatize the threat. These actions highlight not only the vulnerability of small island states, but also the inadequacy of existing systems for handling such crises. The world has dealt with refugees from war and famine. But what about refugees from a drowned country? The politics of water and ice show how climate change is rewriting the logic of borders. In the Arctic, new lands and seas are opening, sparking competition for ownership and resources. In the Pacific and Indian Oceans, existing lands are shrinking or vanishing, raising questions about sovereignty, rights, and survival. In both cases, the very idea of a fixed border is challenged by forces far beyond human control. There is also a symbolic power to these changes. Borders are supposed to be lines of certainty, markers of stability. Yet the melting ice and rising seas show that even geography itself is unstable. What happens when a border drawn on a map no longer matches the land or sea it was meant to mark? For Arctic nations, the challenge is one of expansion, deciding who gets what from the newly revealed seabed. For island states, the challenge is survival, maintaining identity when territory itself is at risk. These issues will only grow more urgent in the decades to come. As ice sheets retreat and seas rise, the politics of water and ice will reshape the global order. Nations will argue over shipping routes and seabed minerals, while others plead for recognition and aid as their homes slip beneath the horizon. The borders of the future may not be drawn with pens and treaties alone, but with waves, currents, and melting ice. In the end, the story of borders has always been about how humans adapt to the landscapes around them. Now, the landscapes themselves are shifting. The Arctic reveals new frontiers while low islands face erasure. Together, they remind us that borders are not carved in stone, but etched on a living, changing planet, and that the greatest negotiator of future boundaries may not be diplomats, but the climate itself. When people first began carving lines into the earth to mark kingdoms and nations, the sky above seemed untouchable. It was a canvas for myths and dreams, a place for gods and stars, not for borders. But as technology has carried humanity higher into the stratosphere, into orbit, and onto the lunar surface, the old question has resurfaced in a new form. Who owns space? Just as rivers and seas once demanded treaties, satellites and planets now force us to ask how far borders really extend. The first step toward thinking about space as a frontier of borders came with satellites. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, it startled the world not just because of its beeping signal, but because it orbited freely over every nation on Earth. If a plane flying over your country without permission is a violation of sovereignty, what about a satellite? Suddenly, states had to decide whether national borders extended infinitely upward or if space was a commons belonging to all. The answer came quickly in practice. No country protested the overflight of satellites, and thus a precedent was born. Outer space, unlike the skies below it, would not be subject to national sovereignty. This principle was formalized in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, sometimes called the Constitution of Space, signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and dozens of other nations. It established that no part of outer space, not the moon, not Mars, not even orbit, could be claimed by any state. It also forbade weapons of mass destruction in orbit, and declared that celestial bodies should be used for peaceful purposes only. On paper, at least, space was to remain free of borders, a realm of cooperation rather than conquest. Of course, treaties and reality are not always the same. Satellites are now indispensable to modern life. They guide airplanes and ships, beam signals for television, track weather patterns, and connect phones. They're also vital for military surveillance and communication. Nations may not own space, but they compete fiercely within it. The United States operates the Global Positioning System, while Europe, Russia, and China all maintain their own navigation constellations. Each system reflects both practical needs and strategic independence. In orbit, competition plays out in the placement of satellites, the crowding of orbits, and the question of who has the right to launch what and where. There is also the problem of space debris. Every rocket stage left adrift Every shattered satellite becomes a piece of junk racing at thousands of miles per hour. The more congested orbit becomes, the harder it is to manage. In a sense, orbital space has already acquired invisible borders, not of politics, but of physics. As certain orbits are filled and others remain viable, companies and governments are beginning to negotiate access to orbital slots through organizations like the International Telecommunication Union, a quiet but crucial way of regulating the sky. Beyond Earth's immediate orbit, the Moon has become the focus of renewed interest. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union planted flags, but both insisted they were symbolic gestures, not claims of ownership. The Outer Space Treaty reinforced this idea. Yet, with modern missions on the horizon, lunar bases, resource extraction, even private ventures, the question of who controls what is resurfacing. Water ice in the Moon's shadowed craters, for example, could provide fuel for future space missions. Companies and states are already imagining how to mine it. And with that imagination comes the possibility of conflict. Some efforts have been made to address this. The Artemis Accords, spearheaded by the United States in 2020, propose rules for sustainable exploration, including the idea of safety zones around lunar operations to prevent interference. Critics argue that this could create de facto borders on the Moon, even if not officially recognized as sovereignty. Just as Antarctic research stations informally carve out zones of influence without claiming the land, lunar bases may become nodes of national presence, each with its own unwritten boundary. Mars and asteroids raise similar questions. Private companies have announced plans to mine asteroids for metals like platinum, while space agencies dream of Martian colonies. But international law is vague on whether individuals or corporations can own extraterrestrial resources. Some countries like the United States and Luxembourg have passed laws granting their companies rights to what they extract. Others argue that such moves undermine the spirit of space as a global commons. The stage is set for future disputes where miners and explorers become the new border makers. Meanwhile, militarization looms in the background. While nuclear weapons are banned in space, nothing prohibits conventional weapons or anti-satellite systems. Already, several nations have tested technologies to disable satellites, sparking fears of a new arms race above the atmosphere. The creation of the United States Space Force in 2019 highlighted the seriousness with which countries are beginning to view space as a potential battleground. Borders may not officially exist in orbit, but the logic of defense and deterrence is seeping upward all the same. And yet space is also a place of cooperation. The International Space Station remains one of the most striking examples of nations working together across borders, literally. Modules built by Russia, the United States, Europe, Japan, and Canada are bolted together, orbiting Earth as a shared outpost. Astronauts from countries with tense relations on the ground share meals, research, and cramped sleeping quarters. The station shows that borders can blur in space, even if only temporarily. What makes space fascinating is that it forces us to imagine borders differently. They cannot be fences or walls. There's nothing to anchor them to. Instead, they appear as agreements, orbital slots, safety zones, or legal definitions. They are abstract, but no less real. As humanity pushes outward, borders will follow, adapting to the new landscapes, or rather skyscapes we encounter. The Moon, satellites, and orbital highways remind us that borders not confined to Earth. Wherever humans go, the impulse to define, divide, and regulate seems to follow. The challenge will be to decide whether space becomes another patchwork of rival sovereignties, or whether it can remain something closer to the borderless dream its treaties once envisioned. In the end, space borders are both futuristic and familiar. They echo the old disputes over seas and colonies, yet they also open new possibilities for cooperation beyond Earth. As rockets lift off and satellites multiply, the question is not whether borders will shape space, but what kind of borders they will be, and whether we will draw them with the same caution and creativity that the cosmos itself inspires. Some of the most powerful borders in the world are not drawn on maps or defended with fences. They exist in the mind, shaping how people see themselves and others. These are the psychological borders, the invisible lines that divide us from them. Unlike rivers or mountain ranges, these frontiers are flexible, shifting with context. Yet they are no less real in their influence. They determine who belongs, who is trusted, and who is kept at a distance. In many ways, the divisions in our minds are older and more enduring than any political boundary.